Chapter 820. The day after the Golden Globe nominations were announced happened to be Friday. With the large-scale release of Sony's Mr. Sugar and Paramount's Star Trek: First Contact, it announced the arrival of the hottest Christmas slot at the end of the year. MGM's Mission Impossible 2 had a strong year-end performance. After the first week's box office of more than $82 million, the three-week cumulative box office had reached $165 million. The total box office of the 19 countries that had been released overseas also exceeded $100 million. It was in the limelight for a while. Kevin Costner, who suffered a big setback with future Waterworld, returned to the ranks of Hollywood's A-list superstars with the strong performance of Mission Impossible 2. Although MGM had negotiated 2 sequels at once during the downturn after the failure of Kevin Costner's future Waterworld, the launch of Mission Impossible 3 would not cause too much of a stir. However, because Mission Impossible had the most eye-catching box office performance of the 3 series in the Agent movie universe, it was conceivable that in the future, Mission Impossible 4, and even the deeper intersections of the Agent movie universe, MGM would inevitably have a tug-of-war negotiation with Kevin Costner again. Of course, strictly speaking, this should be a happy annoyance. Any studio in Hollywood was eagerly looking forward to similar annoyances. Firefly's New Line Cinema's Rush Hour, during the Thanksgiving period, had a box office of $38 million in the fourth week, and a total of $166 million. It became the second film under New Line this year to surpass $100 million. Based on the current box office trend, the total box office of Rush Hour in North America could reach at least $140 million. In the eyes of the outside world, compared to the relatively low box office performance of Firefly this year, New Line's low-budget films under $30 million performed extremely well. New Line produced and released a total of 16 films this year. If not including Jedi Cop 2, that Eric had moved to next year's summer, the average production cost of the remaining 15 films was only $16 million. Based on the released films, New Line only invested $240 million in film production this year, which was not much different from the production cost of Titanic. However, in terms of returns, the North American box office of New Line's 4 best-performing movies this year, Rush Hour, 7 Deadly Sins, Final Destination, and Red Zone, were estimated to reach a total of $350 million. As for the other 11 movies, although there were some failures that only grossed $2 to $3 million, the total box office of the 10 movies was more than $120 million. Under normal circumstances, low and medium budget films often had strong local cultural characteristics, making it difficult for them to make a difference in the overseas market. However, with the overseas box office of $220 million for 7 Deadly Sins, which was more than twice the local box office, New Line's overseas box office also reached $560 million. In 1996, New Line Cinema, with a production budget of $240 million, achieved a total box office of $1.03 billion worldwide. Excluding the income from videotapes and television broadcast rights, just the box office alone brought Firefly Group more than $200 million in profit. Titanic only received an insignificant nomination for Best Screenplay at the Golden Globe Award nomination conference. Although there were many voices of doubt, the general trend of the media was that Titanic was even more negative because of the Golden Globe Award nomination failure. The news of Rush Hour breaking the $100 million box office in North America happened to appear in the media on the same day as the Golden Globe Award nomination. As the producer and distributor of Rush Hour, New Line Cinema's annual production budget, which was very comparable to Titanic, also appeared in the media's vision. With the same production budget of about $200 million, New Line Cinema's 15 low and medium-budget films in 1996 generated more than $1 billion worldwide box office, while the future of Titanic was uncertain at this time. In the eyes of most people, it was almost inevitable that the movie would face a huge loss. This strong contrast undoubtedly poured cold water on the big investment and production trend that had arisen in Hollywood in recent years. Soon, there were many reflective comments in the media. The latest issue of The Hollywood Reporter had a prominent position on the front page and devoted a large amount of space to this. Since the early 1990s, Hollywood seems to have become more and more obsessed with blockbuster films. It is undeniable that movies such as Jurassic Park, The Mummy, and Men in Black have brought unusually high profits to the relevant production companies, but we absolutely can't ignore the disastrous consequences caused to investors and production companies by the failure of big-budget films such as Throat Cut Island, Future Waterworld, The Wind of the Mountain, and Phantom Hero. The tragic failure of Cutthroat Island directly led to Firefly Pictures, which was still very weak at the time, to merge with the Disney Group like a snake swallowing an elephant. And this year, the Firefly Group, which has always been successful in making big movies, seems to be going through an epic disaster, like the one in 1912, together with the unprecedented investment of $215 million in Titanic. On the other hand, film companies such as New Line Cinema, Miramax, and others, which mainly focus on low and medium budget productions, have quietly developed and expanded with cautious and stable production strategies, eating away at the film market share. Especially New Line, a subsidiary of the Firefly Group, has leveraged more than $1 billion worldwide box office with an annual production budget comparable to that of Titanic. As of the first week of December, New Line's share of the box office of North America's cumulative total of $5.9 billion in 1996 reached 7.8%. This proportion is almost comparable to that of the two veteran film companies, Sony Pictures and Paramount Pictures. As a creative industry, of course, Hollywood must achieve innovation and exploration in film production techniques, special effects technology, and other aspects through some high-budget investment projects to achieve the purpose of providing better film and television content to the audience. But at the same time, we have to reflect. Perhaps Hollywood needs to return to the tentpole theory strategy once proposed by Mr. Barry Diller. Using a small number of blockbuster films as tentpoles to prop up a large number of low and medium-budget films as curtains is the most orthodox way for Hollywood film companies to survive. On the contrary, if a film company only wants to rely on a few tentpoles to survive and ignores the existence of the curtains, you can imagine how miserable the scene will be when the storm strikes. After the Hollywood Reporter article was published, a large number of media outlets began to echo it. Eric was in New York, but he also saw the article first. Although he had recently thought about the trajectory of Firefly's development in recent years, Eric still scoffed at the views expressed in the article. The prevalence of big-budget films was almost an inevitable trend in Hollywood's development, because this type of film not only had a natural strong influence, but also movies such as Jurassic Park could not only bring in huge profits from box office, videotapes, and television broadcast rights, but they could also form a profitable peripheral industry chain involving peripheral toys, computer games, franchise licensing, and so on. This potential commercial return was incomparable to low and medium-budget films. Most low and medium-budget films, even if they were successful in the box office, often stopped at videotapes and television broadcast rights. For medium-budget films like Jedi Cop and Rush Hour, which had the potential for sequels, after the success of the first film, the production budget of the sequels would undoubtedly double and inevitably enter the ranks of big-budget films. No matter what the outside media said, no matter how anxious the management of Firefly was, and no matter how the other Hollywood film companies were gloating, the release date of Titanic was still approaching day by day. In the last week, Titanic launched an even more intensive trailer bombardment on Firefly's television network. Giant posters of Titanic also began to be erected in prominent landmark locations in major North American cities. Cameron, Xiao Li, Rachel Weisz, and other film creators appeared on mainstream talk shows in North America. Although Eric did not directly participate in the final stage of Titanic promotion, he spent almost 2 to 3 hours a day in Southampton communicating with Firefly's management, distribution department, and creative team in various aspects. On December 19th, the box office data for the first week of the Christmas season was roughly calculated. The two new films released this week, Star Trek: First Contact and Mr. Sweetheart, earned $43 million and $24 million respectively. According to the box office trend of the two films, it would not have much impact on the upcoming release of Titanic. The comedy The Martian, which was about to be released at the same time as Titanic, was also not a big threat. After all, although it was starring veteran Hollywood superstar Jack Nicholson, it could not be compared to Titanic in terms of production budget, pre-release reputation, or scale of publicity. Although the other Hollywood film companies had the intention to snipe Titanic, they were still a little afraid, and would not directly compete with Titanic, with a heavyweight film. The biggest enemy of Titanic was actually only whether the film could be strongly welcomed by the market and create the original box office miracle like in the original spacetime. The final scale of Titanic was 2,770 cinemas. Although Firefly hoped to have more than 3,000 cinemas, because Titanic was more than 3 hours long and the industry was overwhelmingly pessimistic about this movie, many cinemas that did not have a close relationship with Firefly refused to screen Titanic for Titanic. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Eric and Katzenberg finished discussing the publicity strategy for the first week of Titanic over the phone. After hanging up the phone, he did not think too much about the film. Everything was done, and the rest was up to fate. Eric casually threw his phone on the coffee table in the living room and reached out to pick up his daughter, who was leaning against Joanna and watching TV with her beautiful blue eyes without blinking. He said, "Shasha, it's not good to watch too much TV. Daddy will read you a bedtime story, okay?" Hawaii struggled a little in Eric's arms, but her eyes were still fixed on the TV screen. She said in a dissatisfied tone, "But Daddy, I'm not sleepy. Kevin has already gone to bed. You have to rest early too. You'll be sleepy after listening to a bedtime story for a while," Eric said. Emma, who was sitting next to Drew, also got up and ran over, saying that she wanted to listen to a bedtime story together. She even blinked her big eyes and reached out to Eric to hug her. Emma was going to be 5 years old soon, but the little girl seemed to have a tendency to be small again. Although she was 2 years older than Hawaii and Kevin, she was only a little taller than Hawaii at this time. Eric carried Emma easily and walked to the little girl's bedroom, one in each hand. He asked, "So, what do you want to listen to?" The TV disappeared from sight. Seeing that there was no turning back, Hawaii reluctantly turned to Eric and said, "Daddy, bedtime stories are so boring. Can I read the encyclopedia?" Eric said helplessly, "Baby, if you do that, Daddy will probably fall asleep first." Hearing the conversation between the father and daughter, Joanna and the others on the sofa could not help but chuckle. They knew that Eric had been under a lot of pressure recently. In addition to the gloomy box office prospects of Titanic, Clover Holdings, a subsidiary of Firefly, had suddenly invested $1.5 billion in hot technology stocks on the Nasdaq market in 3 months at the end of the year. Recently, with the company's financial statistics at the end of the year, the news was announced that Eric had a dispute with Way West, a member of the board of directors and one of the shareholders of Firefly Group, in Manhattan a few days ago. Buffett also expressed his doubts and dissatisfaction over the phone. At this time, listening to the relaxed conversation between Eric and his daughter, Joanna and the others knew that Eric's mentality was not too affected by the recent series of events, and they were slightly relieved. The next day, he woke up very early. He looked at the watch on the bedside table. It was just past 7 o'clock, and the sky outside the window was not yet bright. Eric was no longer sleepy. He carefully left the little girl in his arms, quietly put on his clothes, and walked out of the bedroom. The snow from last week had not completely melted yet, and the sky had already turned gray again today. The maids in the manor had already begun to prepare breakfast. Today's newspapers were already on the coffee table in the living room. Eric sat down on the sofa and read them one by one. These days, the topic of Titanic had experienced too much saliva, and the media seemed to be a little tired of it. Although there was a large-scale production last night, because it was in the middle of winter, and because Titanic was a long 3 hours long, many people inevitably gave up watching the midnight screening. There were not many reviews about Titanic in the newspapers today. The overall review was almost the same as the pre-screening stage. The detailed analysis of the media trend would have to wait for the report from the marketing department of Firefly. At this time, Eric could not see the general trend just by reading a few newspapers. Close to 8 o'clock, Joanna and Natasha woke up one after another. Eric had just put down the newspaper and walked into the gym when the phone he carried with him rang. The call was from Katzenberg in Los Angeles. It was only 5 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles, but it was not a problem for Katzenberg. There were two workaholics in the senior management of Firefly Group. One of them was Katzenberg, and the other was, of course, not Eric, but Robert Iger. Compared to Katzenberg's 5 hours of sleep a day, Robert Iger seemed to be more ruthless. He woke up at 4:30 every day. The two talked on the phone for more than 10 minutes. Eric temporarily put down his morning exercise and went to the study. There was a huge white writing board hanging on the entire wall of the study. At this time, the words Titanic were written at the top of the board, and below it was a list of tables. Picking up the black pen next to him, Eric calmly wrote the midnight box office of Titanic in the first grid. $1. 56 million. Calm and collected, neither hot nor cold. Chapter 8:21. As a very common entertainment activity in life, Americans were also very mature when it came to watching movies. They would only choose to watch movies based on their personal preferences and the movie's reputation. The key factor for the success or failure of a movie's box office was always the quality of the movie, and it had little to do with the size of the production budget. This was also the reason why movies such as Cleopatra and Heaven's Gate from many years ago to Throat Cutter Island and Future Waterworld in recent years still suffered box office failures despite spending a jaw-dropping production budget. Before Titanic was released, although there was no lack of positive reviews, the media was almost one-sided in their criticism of the movie's box office prospects. This subtly created a potential impression in the public's mind that this was another expensive movie that was not worth watching like Future Waterworld. The midnight opening of $1.56 million was only one-third of last month's Mission Impossible 2. It was not even as good as Paramount's Star Trek First Contact a week ago. There was no doubt that the lukewarm pre-release reviews and the long duration of the movie prevented most interested audiences from braving the cold winter to stay in the midnight cinema for 3 hours. However, the next day, although there was no dramatic reversal in the reviews of Titanic in the media, audiences who were interested in the movie gradually began to enter the cinema. Manhattan, New York. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Simon Pegg stood in line at the ticket hall of the Paris Cinema on 58th Street near Central Park. He listened to the crowd around him whispering about the new movie that had recently been released. Simon Pegg was not a movie fan. He didn't even like watching movies, or rather, he didn't have the time. As a professional elite who had just jumped to Lehman Brothers as a financial analyst, he, who was born in a poor family in the United States, devoted almost all his energy to his studies and work in order to get rid of his poor life. Even at this time, because of his experience at Columbia Business School, he was still carrying more than $30,000 in student loans from the bank. However, after he jumped ship from his first private investment company and got a job at Lehman Brothers with an annual salary of $68,000, the pressure on him finally lessened. A few months ago, a friend introduced him to a good girlfriend named Charlotte Davis. He was dragged here today by his girlfriend who liked to watch movies. When it was his turn, Simon Pegg handed over his change and asked for a ticket for Titanic. He turned and walked toward his girlfriend, who was waving at him. Simon Pegg waved the movie ticket in his hand at Charlotte, who was holding 2 buckets of popcorn, and said in a persuasive tone, "Hey baby, I just heard people talking about this movie. It doesn't seem to be that good, and it's too long. It's 3 hours long." Charlotte Davis didn't like disaster movies either, but this was a movie that Eric Williams supported. That chance encounter was the deepest secret in the hearts of Charlotte and her best friend, Alice. The two of them didn't easily tell anyone about it. However, because of their encounter back then, the two of them would always subconsciously pay attention to Eric's various movements in Hollywood. They would also subconsciously support the films that Eric valued. Moreover, until now, she had never been disappointed. So, being disappointed once in a while would be a different experience. It was the Christmas holiday, and Alice had returned to Colorado to spend Christmas with her parents. Thus, Charlotte could only watch this movie with her new boyfriend. At this moment, hearing Simon Peck's words, Charlotte gently rolled her eyes. She smiled and asked, "Then what movie do you think we should watch?" Simon Peck subconsciously opened his mouth, but didn't say the name of any movie for a moment. Charlotte knew that her new boyfriend was practically an idiot when it came to movies. She chuckled and ignored his embarrassed look. She stuffed a bucket of popcorn into his arms and said, "Okay, let's go in. It's about to start." Although it was prime time, and it was the first day of Titanic, the theater was still a little empty. Less than half of the 100 people in the theater were seated. Charlotte and her idiot boyfriend chose their seats and sat down. The audience around them were whispering softly. They could even hear a middle school couple in the front row complaining to her boyfriend that he shouldn't have chosen this movie. The boy seemed to be a die-hard fan of the Terminator series. When he talked to the girl, he said that he was only supporting his idol. Charlotte could imagine that most of the audience in the theater chose this movie because they wanted to support a famous director like Cameron, or because of the $215 million investment, or purely because of Firefly's overwhelming publicity. Perhaps, less than a third of the audience was actually interested in the movie. Most cinemas would have about 15 minutes of previews before showing the main movie. However, perhaps due to the long duration of Titanic itself, the trailer this time was only 5 minutes long. Very quickly, the animated logo of a girl from Firefly Pictures releasing fireflies appeared on the screen. The movie began with the treasure hunter Brock Lovett's exploration of the Titanic. Most of the audience immediately realized that the movie was using flashbacks. Westerners generally had a strong love for treasure hunting. Therefore, this scene didn't arouse too much disgust. Most of the audience in the theater enjoyed it. Almost no one thought that the plot was redundant. The white-haired old Rose appeared on the treasure hunting ship, reminiscing about the dusty past. When the gigantic body of the Titanic appeared at the port of Southampton in England, everyone let out faint gasps of surprise. Simon Pegg, who didn't expect anything and just wanted to spend time with his girlfriend, couldn't help but straighten his back. He said in surprise, "Is this real? This is so shocking. I wonder how he did it." Charlotte was very satisfied with Simon Peck's reaction. She explained with a smile. It is said that James Cameron recreated the model of the Titanic on the film set at a scale of 1:1. Looking at the bustling Southampton port that was perfectly restored by James Cameron on the screen, Simon Pegg could not help but shake his head and sigh. No wonder they spent $215 million. This amount of money is enough to build a real giant cruise ship. In the next hour, Jack and Rose met, got to know each other, and fell in love with each other. The movie showed all aspects of the Titanic from the perspective of the two main characters. The extravagance, arrogance, ignorance, and hypocrisy of the nobles in the first-class cabin, and the simplicity, cheerfulness, humor, and optimism of the common people in the bottom-class cabin. Although there were some obvious biases, it still catered to the majority of the audience's disdain for the rich and powerful. As a veteran movie fan, Charlotte could feel that the emotional scenes between Jack and Rose were a little shaky. Many of the dialogues in the first half of the movie seemed to be completely unnecessary. However, with the beautiful scene of Jack and Rose flying at the bow of the ship, and the crew member on the watchtower shouting, "Iceberg, right ahead!" At night, most of the audience's impatience disappeared once again. They silently waited for the arrival of the disaster. Perhaps no one had realized that, through the film's meticulous depiction of the passengers from all walks of life on the Titanic, their emotions had been unknowingly controlled by the big ship. Even though they knew that the sinking was inevitable and a disaster was bound to happen, some of the audience still subconsciously hoped that some impossible miracles would happen. In the end, the miracle didn't happen. After the collision with the iceberg, the Titanic began to fill with water and entered the countdown to sinking. The passengers in the first-class cabin began to evacuate, and the common people in the lower-class cabin were abandoned. The kindness and tolerance of human nature, the ugliness and despicableness, were clearly displayed in front of everyone at the moment of the disaster. If the sinking of the ship only touched everyone's hearts, the last 20 minutes of the movie were completely tear-jerking. Listening to Jack encouraging Rose to live on bravely until she closed her eyes and could no longer speak, and finally quietly sank into the abyss, everyone in the theater felt a heart-wrenching pain in their hearts. Even after Rose was rescued, this heart-wrenching feeling did not dissipate at all. Charlotte clearly heard the faint sobbing sound in the theater. She also felt tears flowing from the corner of her eyes. She wiped them a few times, but no matter how hard she tried, they would not dry. Her body subconsciously leaned against her boyfriend beside her. Simon Peck did not say anything. With red eyes, he reached out an arm and quietly hugged his girlfriend, until the old Rose returned to the past in her dream, and the ending music played. Everyone's emotions did not calm down. After 3 hours, if it were any other movie, perhaps most of the audience's first reaction would be to hurriedly get up and leave the theater when the ending credits rose. However, this time no one got up. Everyone sat quietly in their seats, letting Celine Dion's heavenly voice reverberate in the theater. When they left the theater, it was already 11 o'clock. The theater was still brightly lit. Charlotte leaned against Simon Peck softly. The two walked out of the theater with their arms around each other. Inadvertently, they looked around and found that there were many couples hugging each other with red eyes. For some reason, this scene touched Charlotte's nerves. She could not help but smile. Then, she began to worry again. Originally, she did not have high expectations for Titanic. She just wanted to support the movie that Eric thought highly of. However, she now realized that the media that criticized Titanic before was just talking nonsense. Although there were some flaws, there was no doubt that this was a very good movie. It definitely did not deserve the cold treatment it had received. Absolutely not. After making up her mind, Simon Peck drove her back to her apartment in the city center. Although her boyfriend looked at her expectantly, Charlotte still rejected his offer to stay the night. After sending her boyfriend away gently, Charlotte returned to her apartment. She picked up the cordless phone and called her best friend, Alice, who was in her hometown in Colorado. At the same time, she turned on the computer in the living room. "Hey Alice, did you go to watch Titanic?" The call went through, and Charlotte went straight to the point while operating the computer mouse. The other party said a few words, and Charlotte eagerly said, "No, you must watch this movie. It's definitely a great movie. Do you still remember the New York Times review of Titanic? I can tell you with certainty now that this is indeed a masterpiece comparable to Gone with the Wind." The two chatted for a while and hung up. Charlotte turned her gaze to the computer screen. She had already opened the Yahoo Forums discussion section for Titanic. At this time, the discussion section was also very lively. Unlike the media, who had not even watched the movie, most of the people in the discussion section of Yahoo's Titanic were the audience who had watched the movie. The reactions of this group of people were more realistic and intuitive. "Oh my God, I can't believe I'm crying over such a melodramatic movie. Oh my God, this can't be real. Rose is so beautiful. Why haven't I heard of this actress named Rachel Weisz before? Do you know which movie she has acted in? The ending song is so beautiful. Did you notice that it was written by Eric Williams himself? I've already bought the tickets for tomorrow night. I want to watch it again. The scene of Jack and Rose standing at the bow of the ship is so dreamy. I really want to collect a poster like this. I wonder if Firefly will have a poster like this in the future. Maybe I can sneak a camera in next time and take a picture. Take 2 pictures and give me 1. Take 3 pictures and give me 1. Take 4 pictures and give me 1. Charlotte browsed through the posts on the page. She also had a deep impression of the beautiful scene of Jack and Rose flying at the bow of the ship. She noticed the topic above and clicked in. Looking at the neatly organized replies below, she could not help but smile. Looking at the number of replies, she jokingly typed a few words on the keyboard. Take 109 pictures and give me 1. Exiting the topic and returning to the main page, Charlotte skimmed through the posts on the first few pages. Most of the people were praising Titanic, and some of the posts that were criticizing the film had caused a one-sided crusade by the fans. After organizing her thoughts, Charlotte opened the post page and began to consider her own feelings about the movie. Although she did not have the talent to write movie reviews, at this time, she still wanted more people to know how outstanding this movie was, and that no one should miss it. Before watching this movie, I also had doubts about the 3-hour length of the movie. I don't understand why Firefly allowed James Cameron to make a commercial blockbuster like this. However, at this moment, I suddenly understood a lot of things. Every minute of this movie is indispensable. Although the shipwreck scene only takes up 1/3 of the entire movie, James Cameron has created a perfect "you were there" atmosphere for us. Through more than an hour of panoramic views of the various characters and scenery on the Titanic after it set sail, we are once again brought back to the epic ship of that year, and we are unwittingly immersed in it. Therefore, when the disaster comes, we will also have a more detailed and profound experience of all the characters in the movie, as well as their joy, anger, sorrow, and joy. This is also why many people are deeply moved after watching the movie. The disaster scene in the second half of the movie is even more impressive. Jack's simple and sincere farewell is tear-jerking, and Rose's eyes looking at the sky are even more heartbreaking. The handsome Leonardo DiCaprio and the beautiful Rachel Weisz gave us a very wonderful performance. They are both very outstanding actors, especially Rachel Weisz's natural aristocratic temperament. One can't help but wonder if she was born in a British aristocratic family. Finally, the song "My Heart Will Go On." Celine Dion's heavenly voice is intoxicating. I even feel that Eric Williams spared no effort to support James Cameron's extravagant spending just for this song to create a perfect and sad dream. I can't give any more praise for this movie. I just sincerely hope that everyone can abandon the media's previous bias towards this movie and walk into the cinema. Believe me, you will not be disappointed. After checking, Charlotte clicked on the post and refreshed it several times. Soon, a series of echoing replies appeared under the topic. At this time, in the entire United States, Charlotte was not the only one who was deeply fascinated by Titanic and couldn't wait to recommend it to others. There were countless fans like Charlotte who spontaneously promoted Titanic and recommended it to others around them. With the large-scale release of Titanic, a large number of North American media no longer focused on the topic of the high budget of the movie, but shifted their attention to the quality of the movie itself. While the movie was being spread by word of mouth among fans who had watched it, the movie's reputation began to improve. First of all, I have to admit that I watched this movie with a strong bias. I always felt that Hollywood's investment in big-budget movies had gone crazy. Although I still hold this view after watching this movie, I have to say that James Cameron is really a F***king genius. Titanic almost perfectly restored everything on this giant ship in terms of details, and brought us a deep and tragic love story. The so-called tragedy is to break the perfect thing for people to see. James Cameron did this vividly in 3 hours, but at the same time he didn't take away all our hope. In the movie, the details of the old Rose's life, those photos, that tank of goldfish, all show us her deep love for life. Long Island, in the Southampton Manor, Eric ignored the various changes in the public's attitude towards Titanic, and peacefully spent the upcoming Christmas with his wife and children. However, on the white writing board in the study, there would be an additional number every day. Number 19, $1. 56 million midnight. Number 28, $65 million. Number 21, $9. 67 million. Number 22, $9. 3 million. In the first 3 days, Titanic accumulated a box office of $29. 18 million. Chapter 8:22. Titanic has failed at the box office, earning US $29. 18 million in the first weekend. The total box office in North America may not exceed 100 million. Eric Williams' movie magic has failed. Epic blockbuster off to a dismal start. Firefly Pictures has suffered the largest box office failure in Hollywood history, with a cumulative loss of nearly 200 million US dollars. Word of mouth can't be stopped. Box office is low. Titanic's box office in North America is not as good as Star Trek First Contact's in the same period. The difference in production costs is 5 times. James Cameron led the team of Titanic to a promotional event in London. He looked haggard at the press conference, suspected of having a mental breakdown. Firefly Group CEO, Jeffrey Katzenberg, has announced that Firefly Pictures will not fire Titanic's producers, John Landau, William Stewart, and other main creators. They will continue to work with director James Cameron. Eric Williams has not appeared in public for many days. Casino Royale's post-production may have been halted. The film may follow in Titanic's footsteps. On December 23, the day before Christmas, with the release of Titanic's 3-day box office data, the North American entertainment media launched a new round of bombardment on topics related to the film. If it were any other film, it would not be a failure if it earned US $29.18 million in the first 3 days. However, it was Titanic, the most expensive film in history with a total investment of US $265 million and a global box office of US $800 million to break even. However, Titanic's box office was only US $29.18 million in the first weekend, which was not even comparable to Star Trek: First Contact, which was released the week before. Star Trek: First Contact, which was produced and distributed by Paramount Pictures, cost US $45 million to produce and earned US $30.71 million in the first weekend. The next weekend's box office only dropped 42%, earning US $17.08 million. The cumulative box office in the first 10 days of release had reached US $60 million. Most media outlets had made predictions. Although Titanic's reputation had improved compared to before it was released, due to the long 3-hour film length, most of the audience had lost their motivation to watch the movie. Titanic's box office next week was likely to drop more than Star Trek: First Contact by more than 50%. According to this box office trend, the total box office of Titanic in North America might only be $80 to $90 million US dollars. As everyone knew, the overseas release of Titanic was also blocked by many obstacles. There were only 9 overseas countries where the film was released at the same time, which was less than half of the number of countries where Mission Impossible 2 was released at the same time a month ago. The failure of Titanic at the North American box office would also affect the film's overseas box office. Needless to say, last weekend was the beginning of this week. December 23, $5.57 million. Because it was Monday, compared to the $9.3 million the day before, there was a 40% drop, which was in line with the box office trend of most movies. December 24, $3.05 million. On Christmas Eve, basically no one would go out to watch movies, so it was not surprising that the box office dropped sharply again. Then on December 25, Christmas Day, the box office was $7.03 million. The box office on December 24, Christmas Eve, was not much of a reference. Compared to the box office on December 23, there was a significant increase on December 25. Yesterday morning, when he saw this number, Eric's mood, which had been a little irritable recently, suddenly relaxed a lot. However, he was not too excited. Just as people would not go out to watch movies on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day was usually a great time for people to go out to eat, drink, and have fun. The box office on this day increased. It was hard to say whether it was because of the movie itself or because of the holiday atmosphere. Therefore, on December 26, which was yesterday, the box office data of the last day of the first week of Titanic was particularly important. The box office on this day would also prove whether Titanic, after a week of word-of-mouth fermentation, could regain its former glory. If the box office on this day fell again, and was the same as the $5.57 million box office on Monday, then all expectations would be in vain. If the box office rose, even if it was the same as Christmas Day, then it would indicate that the ship that created an unprecedented box office miracle in the original space-time would set sail again. Eric stared at the writing board on the wall for a moment. The computer on the desktop had been turned on. In the process of entering the password to open the Yahoo email, although Eric felt that he had roughly adjusted his mentality these days, at this time, he found that he could not be indifferent. He even felt that his fingers were trembling with excitement, because of the arrival of some kind of judgment moment. The page opened, and the eye-catching unread email from the Firefly distribution department lay quietly in the mailbox. Eric moved the mouse and gently tapped on the email to open it. The first thing that appeared in front of him was the total box office of the first week calculated by the distribution department. Eric directly skipped the $54.33 million figure and looked down. Quietly staring at the page, after a few seconds of silence, Eric took a deep breath, got up and walked to the writing board. He picked up the pen and quickly wrote the last number of the first week of Titanic. $9.05 million. This Thursday's box office number, compared to the first day of Titanic, was up 4%. Compared to Christmas Day, it was up 11%. Compared to the most comparable Monday, it was up 38%. Eric couldn't help but glance at the 7-day box office numbers again. $8.65 million, $9. $67 million, $9. $3 million, $5. $57 million, $3. $5 million, $7. $03 million, $9. $05 million. The $3.5 million box office seemed to be a freezing point, but in Eric's view, it was more like a spring that was compressed to the extreme. It gathered all its strength and threw a movie that was destined to represent a miracle into the sky. Titanic officially set sail. Throwing the pen into the pen holder, Eric walked out of the study, thinking that maybe there was no need to record the daily box office. How tiring would that be? A new day. Although it was Friday in Hollywood, it was also a new week. Many people woke up from their sleep and inadvertently looked at today's newspaper. They might have noticed the box office numbers of Titanic in the first week. However, for this movie that had been characterized as a failure by most media, except for more and more fans who were touched by the movie, most people didn't think that the $54.33 million figure was a big deal. After all, Mission Impossible 2 last month had a box office of more than $80 million in the first week. Los Angeles. Although it was 3 hours later than New York, Katzenberg saw the box office statistics for the first week of Titanic, almost at the same time as Eric. Of course, he also noticed the unexpected and even somewhat doubtful US $9.05 million box office on the last day of the first week. Initially, Katzenberg even thought that the distribution department had calculated the numbers wrongly. After all, how could the box office on a weekday be higher than on the first day of release? Although it was the Christmas holiday, most people still had the habit of watching movies on the weekend. Katzenberg called the staff in charge of the box office statistics to confirm. Listening to the voice of the person in charge of the distribution department on the phone, Katzenberg was certain that the number was correct. However, Katzenberg didn't think in a more optimistic way. Instead, he thought that this number was the result of the Christmas holiday effect. After all, December 26th was only the second day of Christmas. Later, the executives of other Hollywood film companies, who were also paying close attention to Titanic, also noticed the box office on December 26th. Most people didn't want to delve into it. Even some sharp-witted media had the same idea as Katzenberg. Although Katzenberg felt that this was just an accident, he still immediately called Eric, who was in New York, and reported the good news. After all, the box office predicted that the North American box office would be $80 million to $90 million, but it unexpectedly earned $54.33 million in the first week. The original forecast would definitely be higher. It was almost certain that the box office would exceed $100 million in North America. Katzenberg felt that it was always good to lose less money. Eric didn't tell Katzenberg about his judgment. He wanted to give everyone a surprise. If God wasn't joking with him, then the surprise would only come tomorrow. After talking to Eric on the phone, Katzenberg said goodbye to his wife and twin sons and drove to the Firefly headquarters in Burbank. He had an appointment with Kenneth Horn, the president of New Line Cinema, this morning to discuss the production and distribution plan of New Line Cinema next year. This year, New Line Cinema almost achieved the same box office performance as Firefly Pictures and Disney Pictures. Coupled with the box office failure of Titanic, starting next year, the corporation would definitely need to increase its support for New Line Cinema. During the discussion over the past few days, Katzenberg, Frank Wales, and other senior executives had decided on a plan to increase the average annual film production budget of New Line Cinema to $500 million for the next 3 years. Eric also agreed to this plan on the phone. Today, they were going to discuss the details in more detail. As for the two major production companies, Katzenberg and Frank Wales, they wanted to reduce the budget of big films. In fact, they wanted to reduce the production scale of Firefly Pictures. At the same time, They wanted to refocus on the development of Disney's live-action films. After all, Disney's entire industrial chain, from the surrounding stores to Disneyland, needed a large number of live-action films to provide enough peripheral goods and copyrighted images. This wasn't just limited to animated films. Live-action films were also important. Eric was not as busy as Katzenberg. After breakfast, he leisurely left the manor with a book and walked to a coffee shop on the edge of the community. There were not many customers in the coffee shop in the morning. Eric greeted the old man behind the counter, who was also bored and flipping through the newspaper, and sat in his usual seat. A waitress brought Eric a cup of coffee and left the room quietly. Eric took a sip of the warm coffee and leisurely opened the Financial Alchemy book in his hand. The old man behind the counter, who had always been silent, took the initiative to speak for the first time. Eric, it seems that the box office of Titanic in the first week is not bad. The old man, who looked to be in his 60s, was named Matthew Braga, the owner of this coffee shop. However, Eric knew that the old man also had a manor of similar size not far from his home. The old man was originally from Brazil and was a very famous local entrepreneur. His family ran a large natural rubber business in northeastern Brazil. At this time, he had handed over the family business to his children. He retired with his wife in the United States. Opening such a coffee shop was more for leisure. After all, the two were not familiar with each other. Eric couldn't reveal anything to him. He replied with a smile. If it was other movies, of course it would be good, but this is Titanic. I might lose a lot of money this time. Otherwise, I wouldn't be hiding here now. Matthew Braga laughed, but there was a hint of shrewdness in his eyes. He said, I've never seen you fail before. I hope so. After saying this, both of them became quiet again. Eric continued to read the boring financial book in his hand, while Matthew Braga continued to flip through his newspaper. After about an hour, a blonde Caucasian girl in a white down jacket hurriedly pushed the door open and walked in. When she saw that Eric was already sitting there, she quickly walked over and apologized. I'm so sorry, Mr. Williams. My car broke down, and I had to ask my classmate to send me here. It's okay, Sabrina. Please take a seat. I happen to have some questions that I need you to help me explain. Oh, of course. Sabrina sat down opposite Eric. She took out the book Financial Alchemy, that was identical to Eric's, from her bag. She also had a notebook with her. Then, she patiently explained many of the seemingly simple financial questions to Eric. Of course, these questions were only simple for a graduate student in the Department of Finance at Columbia. Because of the recent turmoil in his mind, Eric was not in the mood to sort out the plot of the Marvel comic universe. Instead, he chose to read a boring financial book to pass the time. The cold financial theory was also easier to calm down. However, if it was a Chinese book, it would be easier to understand some things based on the literal meaning. However, if one wanted to understand a professional financial book in English, one would have to know all kinds of professional and even rare financial English words like the back of one's hand. At most, Eric only had some basic financial knowledge in his mind. Therefore, in order to understand this book, he specially hired a top financial student from Columbia University. That student was Sabrina Rand, a tall blonde girl with a pretty face. Eric had no lack of beautiful girls around him. Of course, he did not have any ulterior motives toward the girl in front of him. The reason why he chose Sabrina from the candidates recommended by Columbia was purely because he wanted to add to his charm. Having a beautiful girl as his study companion would definitely make him feel more comfortable than having a girl of the same sex. As for the Financial Alchemy book that Eric was interested in recently, it had a famous author named George Soros. Chapter 823. Sabrina picked up her coffee and took a sip. She carefully looked at the young man sitting opposite her again. She saw that Eric's eyes were focused on his book. Even though half a month had passed, her eyes were still filled with curiosity. Half a month ago, Sabrina, who was looking for a part-time job during the holidays, received a call from her teacher, who was very reputable in the college. He said that a big shot was looking for a temporary tutor to teach him some basic knowledge about finance. He only needed 3 hours a day in the morning, and he would be paid $200. The higher the university in the United States, the higher the tuition fees. This was one of the main reasons why almost half of the college students in the United States dropped out of school. Other than a few rich kids, most of the college graduates in the United States would more or less take on some student loans. In order to alleviate the financial pressure, many students would choose to work part-time while in school. It was the same for Sabrina. Before this, most of her part-time jobs only paid about $10 an hour. When she heard that she could earn $200 for 3 hours a day, Sabrina could not wait to prepare her resume and submit it to the tutor. However, she did not have high expectations. Although her results in the college were not bad, there were plenty of competitors who were more outstanding than her and wanted to get this job. 2 days later, however, she received a notice that she had gotten the job. After that, she met a senior executive of the Firefly Group who was a vice president. His name seemed to be Alan Fissman. She thought that he was the person she was supposed to tutor. However, it turned out that he was only here to interview her. The two of them chatted casually for half an hour. After that, she was asked to sign a confidentiality agreement that was more than 10 pages long. For a senior executive of the Firefly Group who was a vice president to appear for such an insignificant temporary job, Sabrina vaguely realized that something was up. However, when she finally saw Eric in person, Sabrina was so shocked that her jaw almost dropped. Her workplace was in Southampton, which was more than 100 kilometers away from Columbia University in Manhattan. For this temporary job, Sabrina specially stayed at a classmate's house in Bridges City, which was not far from Southampton. Every morning, she would drive half an hour to this cafe in Southampton. In the first few days, Sabrina spent most of her time explaining a lot of basic knowledge to Eric. She mainly explained the professional terms in the book, Financial Alchemy, written by the financial tycoon George Soros, such as reflexivity, participatory bias, swaps, etc. These questions were very basic for most students who majored in finance. Although Sabrina did not dare to express it, she would occasionally feel a sense of superiority. However, as the days passed, Eric's questions became fewer and fewer. However, they also became more and more tricky. There were a few times when Sabrina was almost speechless. However, recently Sabrina felt like she was becoming more and more like a vase. Other than the first few questions that Eric asked every day, most of the time, he would just read quietly by himself. Occasionally, he would think or he would be in a daze. Perhaps in a few days' time she would lose this well-paid job. At this moment, when she thought of her initial sense of superiority, Sabrina could not help but feel that she was really stupid. The young man in front of her, who had the most personal wealth in the world, was only 2 years older than her. Sabrina could imagine that in 2 years' time, she would at most be able to get a stable job. She would still be miles away from her previous life goal. However, the young man in front of her had already broken through the limits of wealth that most people could have. How much money did he have? 46.5 billion US dollars. No, that was the year before last. Last year, it seemed to be 67.7 billion US dollars. She felt so helpless. After spending more than half a month together, Sabrina would occasionally have thoughts of Cinderella or Cinderella. For this reason, she had been paying special attention to her appearance during this period of time. She had even bought a brand new set of cosmetics. However, until now, other than the book Financial Alchemy, Eric had not communicated much with her. She had not even been to his place of residence. He must have lived nearby. The two of them could only meet in this cafe every day. Occasionally, when he did not come over, someone would inform her to leave. Sabrina noticed that Eric's gaze had once again left the book and started to wander off. After a pause, she suddenly mustered up her courage and said, Eric, last night I went to watch Titanic with my friends." After saying this, Sabrina noticed that Eric's expression froze for a moment. He raised his head and seemed to have just noticed that there was someone sitting opposite him. Immediately, a faint smile appeared on his face. It was a smile that seemed to see through everything. Sabrina felt her cheeks heating up. She felt an inexplicable sense of regret. However, since she had spoken, she still insisted on blurting out the thoughts that she had been mulling over for a while. She said, My friends and I think that this movie has been seriously underestimated. Its box office should have been higher. Eric nodded slightly and said, "Thank you for your affirmation, Sabrina. I'm glad that you liked this movie." After Eric finished speaking, he picked up the book in front of him and looked at the page again. Her attempt to strike up a conversation had ended in failure. However, Sabrina felt much more relaxed. She no longer had the courage to take the initiative to speak again. They continued on like this until noon. Sabrina packed up her things. Eric stood up as well. The two of them walked out of the cafe together. Sabrina was about to say goodbye to Eric and head to the nearby road to see if she could flag down a taxi or hitch a ride home. However, she was stopped by Eric's outstretched hand. "Wait a moment. I'll get someone to send you back," Eric said. Sabrina was stunned for a moment and nodded subconsciously. However, she felt an inexplicable warmth in her heart. In the morning, she had casually mentioned that her car had broken down. She did not expect him to remember it. Before this, she had always thought that he was a cold person. She suddenly felt that she had wronged him. Eric took out his phone and dialed a number. The two of them waited by the roadside outside the cafe. Sabrina quietly carried her bag. After pausing for a while, she made up her mind and said, "Eric, you might not need me anymore. Maybe I don't need to come over tomorrow?" Eric looked at the girl and asked, "You still have a long vacation, right? Do you have anything else to do?" Sabrina thought for a while and shook her head honestly. "Then continue reading with me." Eric smiled and said, "I like to have someone by my side when I'm reading. Also, you smell very nice." Sabrina blushed and said, "Eric, there should be many girls around you who are willing to read with you, right?" "Yes." Eric nodded. "However, they won't explain to me what the reflexivity theory is." "Then," Sabrina asked carefully again, "Eric, may I ask why you are interested in Mr. Soros' book?" Eric answered ambiguously, "Something is going to happen, so I want to understand it in advance." Sabrina saw that Eric did not intend to explain to her in detail, so she tactfully did not ask further. It was not until half a year later, when the world-shocking economic crisis engulfed Southeast Asia, that Sabrina understood what Eric meant. The driver drove the car over. Eric instructed him to send Sabrina back to Bridges before he returned to the manor. Surprisingly, Chris and Emily had already rushed over. The two of them had gone back to Maryland to accompany Jeffrey during the Christmas holidays. He did not expect them to return so soon. Eric hugged the two of them and chatted casually. Chris noticed the book Financial Alchemy in Eric's hand. He smiled and said, "You recently hired a girl just to read this book with you?" Eric nodded and did not forget to joke. "This news has already spread to Maryland?" "Emily heard about it when she was talking to Joan on the phone," Chris explained. However, Emily teased with a smile, "Who knows what he's up to this time?" Eric ignored Emily's teasing and asked, "Why are you back so early? Why don't you stay for a few more days?" "Isn't it because of you? You pushed so much work to Chris while you were so relaxed." Eric sized Emily up from head to toe, making her hair stand on end. He then said, "If you marry Chris now, I'll immediately take away half of his work." When Emily heard this, she was immediately KO'd. She pulled Virginia, who was beside her, and walked toward the villa. She did not forget to explain, "We'll go prepare lunch. You two can chat." Everyone laughed softly. After the women left, Chris returned to the book Financial Alchemy and said, "You've also noticed Soros' actions recently?" Soros did not keep his comments about Southeast Asia's economy a secret. "How can I not notice it? Southeast Asia's economic crisis started in 1997. But in fact, Soros had started to talk about Southeast Asia's economy since the start of this year. But just like the UK a few years ago, sterling, which had been strong for hundreds of years, will not depreciate. Now Southeast Asia, which had experienced more than a decade of false prosperity, also felt their financial system will not be destroyed by international hot money. That's why they did not take any measures to prevent this from happening. Some impatient international currency speculators might have started to short Southeast Asia's currencies. Eric remembered that in February next year, Soros had started to test Thai baht. Chris couldn't help but think of the incident in 1990. He asked, "What do you think this time?" Eric shrugged and said, Southeast Asia will be in big trouble this time. They will not be able to hold on for much longer. Chris's eyes flashed and asked, Then what should we do this time? I have been thinking about this recently. Eric said, We will not be able to replicate the miraculous futures profits during the Kuwait War. That was a sudden super black swan event. Almost no one thought Saddam would dare to invade Kuwait, but he still did. This time it is different. Once Soros leads the attack on Southeast Asia's currency market, it will be a long tug of war. At that time, the amount of international hot money involved will be more than 100 billion. We will not have any advantage over whoever enters the market. And the risk we will bear will not be lower than others. Then what are you going to do? Chris asked. Let's just play around with a few $100 million. Although we can't play too big, we can't just do nothing. That's not my style. These days, Eric had been thinking about the upcoming economic crisis in Southeast Asia. He had thought of doing something big like he did 5 years ago, but he realized it was impossible. The reason was simple. With Firefly Group's current foundation, Eric could easily raise $2 billion in a short period of time. If necessary, Firefly Group could also borrow more than $1 billion in a short period of time from major banks in the United States. Ideally, with $2 billion and 5 times the safety leverage, Fengyu's short position in Southeast Asia's currencies will reach $10 billion. In his memory after the financial crisis, the currencies of the Southeast Asian countries basically depreciated by about 50%. At that time, Eric's short position of $10 billion would be able to earn about $5 billion. $5 billion USD was already a very generous profit figure. After all, the top few corporate giants in the United States only made this amount of profit in a year. However, in Eric's memory, the 4 tigers of Asia, which suffered the most from the financial crisis in Southeast Asia, only had a little more than $100 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Currency speculation was different from international futures. The investors were mainly the banks of the countries that were attacked, and the source of funds was the foreign exchange reserves of the countries. Then, not to mention the later plundering of the stock market, bonds, and even the real economy of various countries, just in terms of currency speculation, there was only a total of more than $100 billion of fat meat. Under the situation of being surrounded by wolves, it was impossible for Eric to establish a short position of $10 billion no matter what. You want to use $2 billion as your capital to swallow 1/10 of it. Do you think the international hot money of more than $100 billion doesn't exist? In the Southeast Asia financial crisis in the original spacetime, Soros bet all his money and only made a little more than $2 billion in the end. Therefore, perhaps those small investors, in the upcoming financial crisis, could take a risk and reap several times the profit. However, when the scale of the hot money reached a certain level, the profit ratio would greatly decrease. In the end, it would be considered good if they could get 20% or 30% of the profit. P.S. Everyone turn on the air conditioner together. The transformer on the street is on fire. So the laptop should have automatically shut down after I got distracted. Fortunately, I prepared a USB demodulator power cable, so I was able to connect to the internet. Chapter 824. December 28th, Saturday. 2 days had passed since Christmas and the New Year was coming. Katzenberg had planned to take his family to Europe for a holiday during the holidays. Although he was a workaholic, it did not mean that he did not need to take a vacation. However, because of the Titanic incident, Katzenberg had to cancel all his itineraries at the end of the year. He did not even return to New York to spend Christmas with his parents. The box office of Titanic was $24.25 million in the first week, which exceeded the expectations of most of Firefly Group's internal and external box office statistics agencies of around $40 million. It was a consolation. However, compared to the huge production and publicity costs of the film, this first week's results could only be said to be a failure. At the moment, this situation seemed to be irreversible. As the CEO of Firefly Group, what Katzenberg had to do now was to try his best to avoid this box office tragedy from happening again. He woke up at 5 o'clock out of habit. After all, it was a holiday and a weekend. Katzenberg did not start his day's work as eagerly as before. After a simple morning exercise, he began to personally prepare breakfast for his wife and children. It was considered his responsibility as a husband and father occasionally. At the same time, in the film distribution department's office at Firefly Group's Burbank headquarters, the employees on duty in charge of box office statistics, George Lake and Phil Ropolos, were doubtfully checking the box office data facts by the major cinema chains. In recent years, with the rapid development of the Internet, the ticketing systems of the major cinema chains in North America had gradually been connected to the Internet, and the efficiency of box office statistics had greatly increased. However, there was still no unified data between the different cinema chains. Therefore, the film companies and specialized box office statistics agencies still needed to summarize the individual data given by the different cinema chains. George Lake and Phil Ropolos once again recalculated the December 27th box office data in their hands. They even made a few phone calls to confirm some of the data that they were doubtful about. After finally confirming that the box office numbers in their hands were correct, George Lake and Phil Ropolos looked at each other in shock for a few seconds. They had worked in the film industry for 5 or 6 years, but looking at the data in their hands, they were 100% sure that this was definitely the strangest box office number they had ever seen in their lives. Although he was almost certain that the box office data in his hands was accurate, George Laker still said to his colleague, "Phil, do you want to confirm it again? What if there's a mistake and the bosses are happy for nothing? We might be kicked out of the door." The tiredness that had accumulated on Phil Ropolos's face due to this arduous task that required him to stay up all night had completely disappeared. He lightly flicked the paper in his hand, releasing a rustling sound. He looked at his companion and said, "Do you think there's still a need? How about we give Mr. Thompson a call first?" George Laker suggested again. "I feel a little uneasy about sending this data directly to the bosses." The Robert Thompson that George Lake was talking about was their immediate boss, the president of Firefly's distribution department. Phil Ropolos looked at the box office data of Titanic in his hand again. 12 million US. In the first week of Titanic release, there was no single day where the box office exceeded 10 million US. This was also one of the reasons why everyone thought Titanic was a box office failure. According to the normal box office trend of most films, the box office of Titanic should be around 6 million US this weekend. But at this time, the data in his hands was actually twice the expected. What did this mean? In the second week of Titanic, not only did the box office not decline, but it also skyrocketed. It was not that Phil Ropolos had never seen a box office decline. Many films that had a strong reputation would have a certain degree of increase in the box office in the second week of release, but the increase was basically very small and rarely exceeded 10%. However, compared to the $8.65 million box office last Friday, the box office of Titanic this Friday was a full 40% higher. Then let's make a call first. In the end, Phil Ropolos, who was also a little guilty, nodded in agreement with George Lake's words. Therefore, before 7 o'clock in the morning, Firefly Group, including Katzenberg, Frank Wells, Carolyn Elliott, Kenneth Horn, and a group of senior executives in Los Angeles, rushed to the headquarters in Burbank. Even Michael Lynn, who had already resigned and only had a board seat at Firefly, heard the news and curiously rushed to Burbank from his mansion in Malibu. Robert Thompson, the president of Firefly's distribution department, pushed the door open and walked into the conference room. The people who were whispering all quieted down and looked at him in unison. "Mr. Katzenberg, and everyone, I have personally called to confirm. Although there may be some errors, the box office of Titanic yesterday should be around 12 million US. After a pause, Robert Thompson added again. In other words, compared to last Friday, the box office of Titanic not only did not decline, but it increased by 3.5 million US, which is 40%. As Robert Thompson spoke, he signaled the secretary behind him to distribute the photocopied box office data report to all the senior executives present. Katzenberg took the detailed data report and couldn't wait to read it. Preliminary statistics showed that on December 27, the box office in the U.S. was $29.5 million. Titanic took the top spot with a box office of $12 million. In second place was Warner Brothers' satirical comedy, A Mess of Three Presidents, which was released this week, with a box office of $5.7 million. Next were films such as The Martians, Mr. Sweetheart, and Star Trek: First Contact. Since the detailed daily box office rankings had already been calculated, the data had to be correct. Staring at the box office data of $12 million, Katzenberg didn't feel any excitement. He was just a little confused. He raised his head and looked around. All the senior executives present had the same expression. They all had the same question on their faces. What happened? After a while, Katzenberg looked at Robert Thompson and asked, "Did you send the box office data to Eric?" "Yes, Jeffrey. We send the box office data to Mr. Williams every day before 6 o'clock in the morning." Robert Thompson nodded and confirmed. Then Katzenberg shook his head halfway through his sentence. If Eric had any feedback, he would definitely have called him or Frank and the others. With that in mind, Katzenberg was no longer in a hurry to understand Eric's reaction. Instead, he looked at everyone. "So everyone, what's the situation now?" Everyone looked at each other and didn't know what to say. Seeing that no one spoke, Robert Thompson, who was sitting at the end of the desk, said tentatively, "I think the current box office trend of Titanic was already showing signs a few days ago." Hearing Robert Thompson speak, Frank Wales looked over and said, "Robert, can you explain in detail?" "Of course." Robert Thompson nodded. He thought for a while and pointed at the writing board behind Katzenberg. After getting permission, he got up and walked over. He picked up a pen and listed the box office data of the week before Titanic that he had just seen in the box office statistics report. "Everyone look." Robert Thompson listed the data of the first 7 days of the first week and added yesterday's $12 million. Then he said to everyone, "The opening weekend of Titanic was indeed very mediocre, and there was a normal drop on Monday of the first week. However, since Christmas, Wednesday was $7.03 million, Thursday was $9.05 million, and Friday, which was yesterday, $12 million. From the box office figures of these 3 days, Titanic experienced an initial mediocre trend. Due to certain reasons, the box office began to show an obvious increase. Katzenberg, Frank Wales, Michael Lynn, and other executives who had worked in the film industry for many years roughly understood what Robert Thompson meant by certain reasons. However, as the group's chief financial officer who had just joined Firefly a few years ago, Carolyn Elliott was a little confused. She asked curiously, "Robert, what do you mean by certain reasons?" Robert Thompson glanced at everyone and hesitated. He said, "I think it's most likely the movie's reputation. This is not a relatively polarized reputation in the media, but a word-of-mouth reputation among the audience. However, the box office trend of Titanic is also very different from the word-of-mouth movies in the past. Those movies may have a reverse drop in the next week, but it's definitely not as exaggerated as Titanic. Therefore, I can't guarantee that there are other reasons we don't know." Everyone discussed it for a while. Seeing that this closed-door discussion could not produce any useful results, Katzenberg waved his hand to stop everyone's discussion. He said to Robert Thompson, "Robert, you'll be personally responsible for this matter. I'll give you 3 days to figure out what happened. Also, help me get through to Eric immediately." The news of the dramatic drop in the box office of Titanic next week could not be hidden for too long. In just one morning, most people had already received the relevant information. Of course, Eric was the first to receive the news. However, because of his experience in his previous life, Eric never worried about the box office prospects of Titanic before the release of Titanic, like Katzenberg, Cameron, and others. Correspondingly, the box office of Titanic began to take off the next week. It was difficult for Eric to understand the relief and excitement of the group's senior executives. After receiving a call from Katzenberg, Eric was still sitting in a coffee shop in Southampton. He was quietly reading George Soros' Financial Alchemy, with the company of the Vase Girl. After all, this was only the first day of the next week. The follow-up box office data had not been confirmed yet. Eric was not in a hurry to let Katzenberg carry out some of the plans he had been brewing in his mind recently. The two just chatted for more than 10 minutes. After hanging up the phone, Eric called Cameron, who was promoting Titanic in Australia. Although it was early in the morning in Australia, Cameron was not resting. Eric told the news of the box office of Titanic next week to this guy who had been anxious recently. Presumably Cameron, who was in Sydney, should be able to sleep well. The release of the box office data of Titanic this Friday only made the Firefly Group senior executives a little confused. When the box office data of the film was released 3 days later, the entire North American media was in a temporary state of confusion. Almost all the media asked the same question. What happened? After the $12 million box office on Friday, the box office on Saturday did not show any signs of decline. Instead, it rose slightly to $12.46 million. Then the box office on Sunday was $10.86 million. In the end, the 3-day box office of Titanic this weekend totaled $35.44 million, compared to the $29.18 million box office of the first weekend. It was an increase of more than $600. Although the overall increase was not as terrifying as Friday's, the percentage of decline was still more than 20%. Immediately after, under Katzenberg's personal instructions, Robert Thompson also came up with a preliminary box office survey report. At this time, the reviews of Titanic by the mainstream media in North America no longer had any reference value. Robert Thompson directly hired a professional survey and evaluation agency. In 3 days, he directly collected 20,000 audience questionnaires in major cities in the United States. The results of the survey showed that more than 20% of the audience who watched Titanic next week were watching the movie for the second time. 30% of the audience went to the cinema to watch the movie under the strong recommendation of their relatives and friends. Although most of the audience felt that the 3-hour length of Titanic was the biggest obstacle for them to go to the cinema before watching the movie, more than 80% of the audience found that they had completely ignored the issue of time during the movie. In other words, the movie's outstanding special effects, plot, and rhythm made them completely forget the passage of time. At the same time, according to the 10-point scoring system, the most direct score from the audience actually reached a surprising number of 8 points, far exceeding the previous average of 7 points from the media. The reputation of Titanic among the audience also achieved a reversal. Chapter 825. Initially, when the 3-day box office of Titanic was announced to be less than $30 million in the first weekend, almost all forecasting agencies believed that the North American box office of this mega blockbuster with a total investment of $265 million would probably not exceed $90 million. But in fact, it only took 10 days for the box office of Titanic to reach $69 million, which was only one step away from $90 million. This made most of the media's predictions a week ago instantly become a joke. The $44 million box office of Titanic in the first 3 days of the second weekend made all the media who had been cynical about Titanic shut their mouths. On the second working day, because it happened to be the new year, coupled with the further spread of the word of mouth of Titanic and the publicity effect of the box office of the next week, the box office of Titanic on the second working day only fell by less than 30% compared to the weekend. The box office for the 2 days before and after New Year's Day once again returned to the level of $10 million per day. After the second week, Firefly Group immediately announced the box office of Titanic for the second week, which was $52 million. With the excellent box office performance on weekdays, the box office of Titanic in the second week fell by an astonishing 35% compared to the first week. What kind of concept was this? In the North American film market, if a film's decline in the next week's box office could maintain about 35%, the studio would be very satisfied, because this meant that the film's word of mouth and box office were very good, and it had been a commercial success. As for those films that could maintain the same box office as the first week, or even achieve a slight reversal, they were all box office blockbusters that could leave their names in the film and television industry. A film company might not encounter such a godlike blockbuster in 10 or 20 years, or even until they went bankrupt. But now, the box office trend of Titanic had completely broken everyone's traditional understanding of the box office curve. Most people, whether inside or outside Hollywood, would have a strong sense of confusion in their hearts when they saw the next week's box office data of Titanic. Shouldn't it have fallen by 35%? No matter how strong the mental power of millions of people was, it could not change the fact that Titanic did achieve a 35% reversal in the box office in the second week, reaching $73.52 million in the first week, and a 2-week box office of $127 million. However, everything had just begun. The new year, January 3rd, Friday. According to the time division rules of the North American film market, this was the first week of the 1997 year. At the end of the 2-week legal holiday, Titanic's weekly box office also fell immediately, dropping to $45.01 million, a drop of 38%. When everyone thought that the box office curve of the film was beginning to return to normal, Titanic's box office declined again, in the fourth week, to 16%. It was reduced to $37.56 million. At this time, the 4-week box office of Titanic had reached $210.34 million. In comparison, a month ago, Mission Impossible 2, which opened with a strong first-week box office of $82.7 million, only had a 4-week box office of $181.3 million. Moreover, after 4 weeks of screening, Mission Impossible 2's box office had fallen to about $20 million. Titanic, however, still maintained a huge potential box office of $40 million. After half a month of confusion, doubts, and silence, as the total box office of Titanic exceeded $200 million, the North American media finally began to speak. They changed the pessimism and ridicule before the film's release, and instead analyzed the causes and consequences of Titanic's box office success. $200 million in 4 weeks, the box office potential was endless. Although there was still a lot of pressure on the cost, at this point, no one dared to rashly say that Titanic could not recover its production cost. On the other hand, although many film critics who criticized Titanic were still stubborn in the face of the movie's godlike box office trend, as more and more film reviews appeared in newspapers and magazines across the United States, the overall film review of Titanic began to reverse. As the first to express praise for Titanic, the New York Times once again published a special review after the box office exceeded $200 million. The extravagant setting, the shocking and magnificent sunken ship special effects, the beautiful and magnificent soundtrack, the touching love story. All of this reminds me of the sensational Gone with the Wind. There are undoubtedly too many similarities between these two films. Gone with the Wind perfectly recreated the rise and fall of the plantations in the Southern Union more than 100 years ago, and Titanic impeccably showed the terrible disaster of the supposedly unsinkable luxury ship sinking to the bottom of the sea on its first voyage. Gone with the Wind wasn't the first color movie, but it brought Hollywood color movies to their heyday. Titanic wasn't the first CG special effects blockbuster. Before that, we already had Tornado, Terminator, Jurassic Park, Men in Black, and other special effects blockbusters. But there's no doubt that Titanic will also usher in a brand new era for Hollywood, an era of special effects movies. After the scandal was exposed, not only did it cause the credibility of the Golden Globe Awards to plummet, but CBS also stopped the television broadcast cooperation with the Golden Globe Awards organizers. Later, in order to make people forget as much as possible, the Golden Globe Awards canceled the Best Newcomer award. The reversal of Titanic's reputation and box office was undoubtedly the most exciting to the film's fans. The audience's perception of a film was the most direct. They clearly remembered the cold reception and ridicule before and at the beginning of the film's release. When the film's reputation and box office showed a strong reversal in recent weeks, the fans, who almost felt the whole process because of their love for Titanic, were in a state of excitement and pride. They paid more attention to all information about Titanic. When the controversy of Titanic's nomination for the Golden Globe Awards broke out, the fans quickly gave the most direct and rude feedback on the rapidly rising internet media in recent years. It's hard to imagine that the 90-odd judges of the Golden Globe Awards could completely ignore all the merits of Titanic. I can only guess that this bunch of old men must have fallen asleep before the movie started. Since you're already so old that you can't even watch movies, what's the point of the Golden Globe Awards? In any case, the excellence of Titanic can't be hidden. The North American box office of this film has exceeded $200 million. It's said that the overseas box office is also very good. So, why should we care about such an insignificant award? Everyone choosing to ignore it is probably the best respect for the Golden Globe Awards. I hope that on January 19th, no one will jump to NBC. Golden Globe Awards, who cares? Is there anyone here in Queens, New York? Maybe we can buy tickets together and watch it again tonight. I only care about the box office of Titanic now. From the beginning, this was a conspiracy. Some people hoped that Titanic would become a complete failure, so they attacked the film at the Golden Globe Awards. However, Titanic once again proved to us that gold will always shine. Obviously, Titanic is not only gold, but also a diamond. It is the most dazzling heart of the ocean. The boycott of the Golden Globe Awards has begun. Friends who want to support Titanic, please support us. Our campaign URL is: amidst the one-sided doubts and condemnations from the media and the internet, the Golden Globe Awards organizers had to take the initiative to issue an announcement before the awards ceremony. They firmly denied all the accusations of the unscrupulous media against the Golden Globe Awards judges, and stated that the judging process of the Golden Globe Awards was absolutely fair. The reason why Titanic was not nominated was because there were too many excellent films this year and Titanic's performance in terms of artistic quality was not outstanding. In order to prepare for the Super Bowl trailer of Casino Royale, Eric returned to Los Angeles after the new year. Eric just laughed at the Golden Globe Awards jury statement that was obviously nonsense. Firefly Group did not add fuel to the fire behind the recent media frenzy, and Yahoo even deleted some of the extreme comments against the Golden Globe Awards on the Yahoo forum. After all, even though Titanic wasn't nominated, Catherine's Red Alert and Fox's Miramax's Shakespeare's Love were the two hottest movies of this award season. As they both belonged to the genre of artistic films that were slow to gain popularity, the distribution strategy of the two films was similar. Currently, they were both in the small-scale stage of showing in 300 to 400 cinemas. It was expected that after the Golden Globe Awards, the screening scale would expand to more than 1,000 cinemas. The two films belonged to the drama category and the musical comedy category respectively. There was no conflict in the main nominations. If they could win an award, it would play a good role in promoting the later box office of the two films. Since Titanic had already become a reality, Eric would not affect the release of these two movies for the sake of a moment of anger. Of course, it was impossible for Firefly to be indifferent to the obvious unfair treatment of Titanic. Although the crew of Titanic received an invitation from the Golden Globe Awards organizers, hoping that they could attend this year's awards ceremony, the Golden Globe Awards judges even personally called Eric to invite him. However, Eric still declined with the excuse that he was busy. As for the main creators of Titanic, none of them would attend the awards ceremony that day. Although he was nominated for Best Screenplay, Cameron's resentment towards the Golden Globe Awards was definitely stronger than anyone in the crew. Of course, he would not attend. During the time he returned to Los Angeles, in addition to restarting the post-production work of Casino Royale, Eric also invested a lot of energy in the follow-up work of Titanic. Before the release of the film, there were generally negative opinions in the industry. When Titanic was released in North America, only 9 countries had achieved the same release overseas. In addition to the United Kingdom and Australia, Germany, France, and Italy, which were important box office markets in Europe, had not been released yet. Originally, if Firefly had forced the release of Titanic, with the strong distribution strength of the group, it should have been able to get a big release in the overseas market in January or February. However, this was not what Eric wanted. For the current overseas film markets in Europe, East Asia, and Latin America, the January or February release after the new year was the unpopular period after the holidays. Although it could not stop the destined rise of Titanic, it certainly could not exert enough box office potential. According to the current box office trend of Titanic, Eric estimated that the film would break the North American box office record, and the total box office would exceed $500 million at the end of March. At the same time, there was another important event for Hollywood movies in March, which was the Oscars. It was conceivable that as long as it was done properly, March would definitely be the most popular time for Titanic. Therefore, Eric placed the focus of the next stage of the overseas release of Titanic during the Easter period in March. At that time, the global box office of Titanic, in this spacetime, would definitely exceed the $1.8 billion in his previous life, due to the strong influence brought about by breaking the box office record and winning the Oscars. The North American box office trend of Titanic had been determined. What Firefly had to do next, of course, was to make sure that Titanic would win enough Oscars. Chapter 826. I talked to John Landau and the others this morning. Robert is also keeping an eye on this matter personally. There are 10 technical Oscar nominations, and we should be able to win all of them this time. Titanic can be said to be undisputed in this regard. However, for the 6 core nominations for Best Film, Best Director, and the 4 major acting awards, there is no hope for Best Actor and Best Supporting Actor. Leonardo's performance can only be said to be passable, and there are no outstanding male supporting actors in the film. As for the other 4 awards, the nominations should be fixed in advance. In the spacious office loft of the Digital Domain at Firefly Studios, Eric and Katzenberg sat together in the lounge. After listening to him, Eric asked, "So it's still 14 nominations?" Katzenberg did not detect the hidden meaning in Eric's words. He thought that Eric had thought about it before, so he nodded and said, "Yes, 14 nominations. There are 24 Oscars in total, but Titanic will definitely not be nominated for Best Foreign Language Film, Best Animation, and other unrelated awards. This eliminates 7 nominations first. Among the remaining 17 nominations, Best Soundtrack is divided into Drama and Musical Comedy, which eliminates another one. We have no hope of winning Best Actor and Best Supporting Actor, so there are only 14 nominations left. However, with just these 14 nominations, we can already match the nomination record set by Comet Beauty in 1950, and it is very likely that we will win more awards than Ben-Hur." Eric had already realized the mistake in his words when he said it. Fortunately, Katzenberg did not care, and did not show any abnormalities. If it were not for the recent media doubts about the Golden Globe Awards, Eric might have forced people to release another Best Actor nomination for Leonardo, surpassing the nomination record of Comet Beauty. However, because of the widespread doubts about the Golden Globe Awards, although the Oscar jury did not dare to ignore the strength of Titanic, this time, they also paid more attention to their own credibility. Xiao Li's performance obviously did not meet the standards. If he was nominated for an award, the media would definitely turn their attention to the Oscars after the nominations were announced. Although they could not break the record of Comet Beauty, in terms of the number of nominations, as Katzenberg said, it was very likely that they would surpass the historical record of Ben-Hur, with 11 Oscars. After the two discussed the details of the PR, Eric asked, "How's the overseas distribution going?" Similar to North America, most of the overseas countries where Titanic has been released had box office results similar to North America. Especially in the United Kingdom, the 4-week box office conversion had exceeded $36 million. According to the current box office trend, the UK box office of Titanic would easily surpass the $71 million box office record set by Jurassic Park a few years ago. It was not impossible for it to exceed $100 million. In addition, the box office performance in Spain, Australia, and other countries and regions was also very good. Just these 9 overseas box office markets that have been released, the cumulative box office in a month reached $92 million. Stimulated by such outstanding box office results, The overseas film companies, who were initially indifferent to the release of Titanic, had completely changed their initial attitude and were extremely eager. I will fly to Europe next week, and Robert will also rush to Japan to personally negotiate with the local distribution and cinemas. Katzenberg paused and said, Eric, my idea is that we don't need to pursue a higher percentage of shares. The average share of 35% is already very good compared to the previous years. If we ask for a higher share, it will definitely dampen the enthusiasm of the local distributors. However, we can ask for more resources in terms of publicity, scheduling, and cinemas. Although Firefly had its own branch companies in the major countries in the world, the specific distribution work still needed to cooperate with the local distribution companies. It was inevitable that they would give a certain percentage of the distribution to the other party. Katzenberg was personally responsible for the European distribution, and Robert Thompson, the president of the distribution department, was responsible for Japan. Eric was also very satisfied with this arrangement. After thinking about it, Eric nodded and said, Then we'll do as you say. Also, ask Robert to go to China and see if it is possible to get a share of the profits for Titanic. Katzenberg was a little puzzled. Over the years, Eric had inadvertently reminded him that Firefly would deliberately fight for 1 or 2 quotas in the Chinese market every year. But to be honest, although there was a huge population of more than 1 billion people, the movie market was pitifully small, and the proportion of shares was so low that it made his hair stand on end. However, he did not question Eric's decision. After all, this was just a small matter. He nodded and said, Eric, there is one more thing. Harvey wants to start the production of Machida in advance. Some time ago, when you were in New York, he talked to me about this. Recently, he has been busy with Shakespeare's Love, so he probably didn't have time to talk to you, right? Eric originally planned to release Machida and other self-produced dramas like Machida when FFM TV's business situation stabilized this fall. When he heard Katzenberg's words, Eric asked, What does he think? Didn't you say that Machida is a slow type of drama that should mainly rely on awards to gain fame? Katzenberg said, Harvey thinks that since this is the case, it's best to start production now and air it in the spring and March. That way, it can compete for the Emmy Awards in August. If it's delayed to the fall, it will definitely miss this year's Emmy Awards. There is also a year-long gap between next year's Emmy Awards. By then, even if Machida wins, the influence of the first season will be greatly reduced. It will not be good for the later distribution of videotapes/DVDs. After resting in New York for nearly a month and being troubled by Titanic, Eric returned to Los Angeles again. He realized that too many things had unknowingly accumulated. Needless to say, the post-production work of Casino Royale was needless to say. In other aspects, Eric instructed Chris to acquire the British Arm Company before the new year. Both parties had signed the acquisition contract, but many follow-up decisions still needed Eric's approval. In addition, the setting of the Marvel Cinematic Universe plan, the listing of the MP3 player, the equity investment of Shamrock Holdings, the operation of FFM TV, and so on. Although these matters were handled by professionals, there was still a lot of work that needed to be done by Eric personally. Harvey is an expert in the operation of awards. Since he thinks it's suitable, let's air it in the spring. Well, I will find time to call him tonight to talk about this. Tonight? Katzenberg raised his eyebrows slightly and said with a smile, Harvey might not be free tonight. Oh, I almost forgot. It's the Golden Globe Awards ceremony tonight. Let's wait for another time. Eric shrugged and did not intend to talk more. Only the main creative team of Red Alert would attend the awards ceremony tonight. The team of Titanic had already decided not to attend. Lastly, there's the matter of Shamrock Holdings. Katzenberg was obviously not interested in talking about the Golden Globe Awards. Both of them were busy people, so he quickly switched to the next topic and said, In addition to the recent purchases, we have invested $1.88 billion in the main IT stocks on Nasdaq. According to the trend of Nasdaq in recent months, the book profit of these stocks has exceeded $210 million. Eric nodded. He already knew these figures. Because of the stock investment in the Nasdaq market, Firefly's net profit this year would drop to about $1 billion. Coupled with the final balance of the sale of the paper assets and the animation studio 2 years ago, the total would not exceed $2 billion. This was because Eric needed to take a large amount of profits from Firefly Group and invest them in the internet company under Firefly. Otherwise, Clover Holdings would have bought more, and at the same time, they could also save more taxes for the time being. Eric felt that Katzenberg would not mention this matter alone. Sure enough, Carson quickly said, Warren Buffett, Tom Murphy, and David West have called me many times recently. I'm sure you'll receive more calls from them as well. If it weren't for the fact that Clover Holdings stocks have turned a profit, they would definitely have more complaints. I told David West last time. Eric picked up the coffee pot next to him, refilled a cup of coffee for himself, and continued. I told them that if they have doubts about Firefly Group's business strategy, I can buy back their shares at any time. David West had contributed a lot in the process of Firefly's acquisition of ABC, so he was able to become one of the 3 external directors of Firefly Group. Moreover, the group of small shareholders of Firefly Group that he represented from major investment funds held nearly 14% of Firefly Group's shares at this time. Buffett and Tom Murphy only controlled 10%. Although they were close at first, the two sides represented different interest groups after all. In the first 2 years, because of the continuous sale of paper assets, hand-drawn animation studios, and the strong profitability of the group itself, these investment funds received about $500 million in profit dividends from Firefly Group every year with the 14% equity in their hands. This amount of money was enough for the managers of those funds to add a highlight to their annual financial reports. But this year, because of the additional expenses of Shamrock Holdings, the profits and dividends received by small shareholders of Firefly Group such as Berkshire Hathaway and State Street Global Fund would suddenly drop by more than half. In addition, these people were experts in the field of investment. They obviously had a strong distrust of Eric's vision in stock investment. Therefore, they were full of dissatisfaction with his large purchase of Nasdaq shares. Katzenberg listened to Eric and smiled. Unless they're crazy, they won't ask you to buy back their shares. However, David West and I discussed another matter on the phone yesterday. You mentioned it before, and I think the timing is good. Eric thought about it and suddenly understood. He said, he wants to list Digital Domain? Although he felt that Eric could guess it, he was still a little surprised by his quick reaction. Katzenberg smiled and nodded. That's right, Eric. According to the current box office trend of Titanic, this film's global box office will definitely exceed $1 billion. As a film focused on CG special effects, the success of Titanic will definitely further stimulate the development of the Hollywood special effects industry. Therefore, I also think that it should be the best time to list Digital Domain. David also revealed to me that if Digital Domain is listed, Wall Street should be able to value it at around $3 billion. Katzenberg and David West's current thoughts coincided with Eric's thoughts a few years ago. Eric knew the future trajectory of the Hollywood special effects industry. Although in recent years, Hollywood special effects companies could still be regarded as a highly respected noble industry, with the rapid development of computer technology and related software industries in the next 10 years, with the support of top-notch hardware and professional special effects software, it would be easy to set up a special effects studio. At that time, the competition in the special effects industry would also be extremely fierce. Therefore, Eric had also thought that if Titanic could achieve the same success as the original Spacetime, then CG special effects would definitely be highly valued. At this time, it would be the best time to let the Digital Domain go public and get a large amount of cash. However, after what happened some time ago, Eric had changed his mind. Perhaps in 10 years or even 5 years, the special effects industry would no longer have a high threshold. But now Digital Domain was definitely the top special effects company in the industry. Therefore, if they cut off their external cooperation in the digital field, Firefly could at least maintain a lead in the field of special effects for more than 3 years. 3 years was enough for Firefly to leave other Hollywood film companies far behind in terms of special effects films. Even 3 years later, with Firefly Group's huge economy, and the support of its allies like MGM and 20th Century Fox, there would still be no shortage of projects in the digital field. Even in the longer term, as long as the digital field had outstanding special effects technology, even if it could not achieve profits or even a slight loss, Firefly Group would be able to support such an exclusive subsidiary. Moreover, even if Wall Street valued digital domain as high as US $3 billion, Firefly could only get US $600 million at most if it was listed at this time. US $600 million was nothing to Firefly. It could be imagined that David West's suggestion was not just for the US $600 million. P.S. A bug appeared in yesterday's chapter. Spain should have already been released in the setting, and has been modified. Chapter 827. As a world-class financial center, Wall Street was like a giant capital distribution port. Retirement funds, insurance funds, investment funds from the mainland states of the United States, as well as capital from overseas countries, used investment banks and major exchanges as a medium to influence and even control the economy of the United States and the world. It was not an exaggeration to say that Wall Street controlled the economy of the United States. Most of the top 500 companies in the United States were controlled by Wall Street capital through listing. It was almost the instinct of all Wall Street capital forces to penetrate the economy of the United States, and even overseas to achieve the purpose of control. Therefore, the Firefly Group, which had risen rapidly in recent years but was completely out of the control of capital, was particularly conspicuous in Hollywood, which was generally controlled by Wall Street. For shareholders of a company, unless they had a speculative mentality, no company would easily choose to go public and give up their control to Wall Street. Eric admitted that he had a very speculative mentality in the first few years, but with the rapid expansion of the Firefly system and the continuous expansion of his personal vision, the initial impetuous thoughts had long disappeared. Although he still would not easily let go of the opportunity to quickly seize profits like the Asian financial crisis and the dot-com bubble, Eric did not think of listing his most important foundation, the Firefly Group, even a long time ago. As the Firefly Group became more and more powerful, this idea was even more out of the question. But Wall Street obviously would not easily let go of the effort to penetrate the Firefly Group. The promotion of the digital sector should be a test by Wall Street. Since they could not promote the listing of the Firefly Group as a whole, they would separate it step by step and gradually realize the connection with the capital market. This might be the idea of some capital forces on Wall Street. Katzenberg had been focused on the operation of the Firefly Group for the past few years, so he might not have noticed David West's intention to promote the listing of the digital sector. Eric paid far more attention to the capital market than Katzenberg. After thinking for a moment, Eric said, "Jeffrey, have you thought about it? If we agree to let the digital sector go public this time, then maybe it will be Pixar, then New Line Cinema, Firefly Pictures, Disney. In the end, maybe one day you suddenly wake up, and the Firefly Group has once again become a pawn in the hands of Wall Street. At that time, it will be difficult for us to run this company with our own will." Among the 7 major Hollywood companies, only Firefly has developed the digital sector because we can invest hundreds of millions of dollars in the research and development of CG special effects technology for several years without considering the temporary gains and losses in the financial report. But other companies, in order to satisfy Wall Street, in order to make their annual or even quarterly financial reports more beautiful, they don't dare and can't do this. Otherwise, even if they are planning for the company, it is still difficult for them to be recognized by capital. Okay, I understand. Katzenberg grinned. Eric did not directly reject the proposal to let the digital sector go public. Instead, he analyzed the pros and cons in detail. Of course, Katzenberg knew that Eric was worried about his personal feelings. In fact, he felt that Eric didn't have to do this at all. After all, in most cases, if he felt that some of his subordinates' suggestions were bad, he would simply say **T. He rarely explained anything to his subordinates. Katzenberg looked at the Financial Alchemy book that Eric had been holding in his hand. He half-jokingly said, "Maybe I should also take some time to read some books." "If you're interested." Eric smiled and handed over the book in his hand. He said, "This is for you." I bought a few. Katzenberg took it and thanked him. He then asked, "I've seen you reading this book a lot recently. What is it about?" Soros's investment diary, Eric explained simply. Without 3 to 5 years of foreign exchange investment experience, most people won't be able to understand it. So I suggest you skip the theory at the front and read the case studies at the back. You don't have to deliberately understand those obscure foreign exchange operations. You just have to understand Soros's way of thinking. He's a guy with a really big heart. He even reminds me of a famous saying from the distant East. Katzenberg secretly took note of Eric's words. His education level was not high. He had entered society and started working before graduating from high school. However, this did not mean that he was a person who did not want to make progress. Otherwise, he would not have been able to sit in his current position. Katzenberg was about to put away the book when he heard Eric's last sentence. He asked curiously, "What famous saying from the East?" It's not interesting to explain this. It's like a sonnet poem. If it's translated into another language, it's difficult to have the same charm. In short, it's my evaluation of Soros. Oh right, I wrote it on the title page. Katzenberg did not delve deeper. He flipped open the book with interest and saw 2 lines of unfamiliar pencil-written words on the title page. Heaven and earth as the furnace, nature as the work, yin and yang as the coal, everything as the copper. Although Katzenberg couldn't understand the flamboyant semi-cursive handwriting, he could still feel a wonderful sense of beauty. Throughout the 1980s, Soros used the reflexive theory he created as a foundation, and used the global financial market as his laboratory. Through large-scale financial operations that had a profound impact on many countries in the world, he put his theory into practice. Therefore, this book was called Financial Alchemy. If one did not consider Soros' destruction of the economic systems of many countries from the perspective of good and evil, such a financial tycoon who could influence the direction of the world economy was worthy of the evaluation in Ode to the Rocks. Eric skipped this simple interlude and said, "So, let's not talk about the digital listing plan anymore. However, since we're talking about this, let's talk about our next development plan for the digital field." On January 19th, the 54th Golden Globe Awards ceremony was held. Mira Mike's Shakespeare in Love and Firefly Pictures' Red Alert led this year's Golden Globe Awards. They won Best Picture in the Musical Comedy category and Best Picture in the Drama category, respectively. The Weinstein brothers were originally aiming for the Oscars. However, because of the strong rise of Titanic, Harvey Weinstein realized that Shakespeare in Love would not be able to win the Oscars, so he decisively gave up. Instead, he focused on the Golden Globe Awards and won 5 awards in the Musical Comedy category: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Screenplay. In comparison, Red Alert paled in comparison. Although it won the Best Film Award in the Drama category, it lost to Shakespeare's Love in the Best Director and Best Screenplay categories. However, even though Firefly did not deliberately create hype, it was impossible for the media and fans to not notice. This was the second time Cameron and Catherine were competing against each other. Correspondingly, Red Alert received more attention than Shakespeare's Love, which the Weinstein brothers had worked hard to create hype for. After the Golden Globe Awards, Shakespeare in Love and Red Alert both greatly increased the number of showtimes, and the box office also began to rise. 3 days after the Golden Globe Awards ceremony, on January 22nd, the 69th Oscar nominations were announced. Titanic was unsurprisingly the most talked about film of this year's Oscars with 14 nominations. All of the nominations for Titanic could be said to be well-deserved. Therefore, when the 14 nominations were announced, the media inevitably turned around and ridiculed the recent Golden Globe Awards. Stimulated by the continuous topics of the Golden Globe Awards ceremony and the announcement of the Oscar nominations, the box office of Titanic, in the 5th week of its release, miraculously fell again, reaching $42.62 million for a total of $252 million. A week ago, in the face of the miraculous fall of Titanic in the 2nd week and the subsequent consecutive week drops, the North American media only predicted that the film might reach the heights of Star Wars and Jurassic Park. However, when the box office data for the fifth week was released, the drop again made all the media cautious. After waiting patiently for a week, in the sixth week, the weekly box office of Titanic reached $32.83 million, once again achieving a weak drop of 22% in the weekly box office. Therefore, the media, who were in a state of careful observation, finally began to speak out, predicting that Titanic might become the highest-grossing film in North American history. However, at the same time, no one predicted the final box office of Titanic. Who could predict? In 6 weeks, the box office in North America was $285 million, and the overseas box office was $147 million. The global box office of Titanic reached $432 million, and Firefly was able to get a $200 million share. It was only a matter of time before they recouped their $265 million total cost. At the same time, many media outlets also found that the 5 major box office countries in Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, were only released in the United Kingdom and Spain. Germany, France, and Italy, whose box office potential was not inferior to the United Kingdom, were not released yet. On the other hand, the biggest box office market in Asia, Japan, was also not released. Coupled with the Latin American and Southeast Asian markets, which were also in the release stage, the overseas box office of Titanic might reach a terrifying number that far exceeded that of North America. The shock of the box office of Titanic had not yet subsided when Firefly Group released another explosive news. On February 1st, Firefly Group suddenly announced that after completing the existing film and television special effects orders, Firefly's digital domain special effects company, including the 3 branches in Los Angeles, Florida, and Sydney, would no longer accept film and television special effects orders from Firefly Group and its partners, MGM Pictures and 20th Century Fox. Instead, they would mainly focus on film project production within Firefly Group and its partners. However, Firefly Software, which was mainly responsible for developing basic tools and software for digital domain and Pixar animation, would continue to sell Maya, 3D Max, and other special effects software and special effects solutions to the public. The special effects studios that use Firefly Software's tools and software would also have priority in obtaining additional special effects outsourcing orders from Firefly Group. As a non-listed company, Firefly Group simply published an announcement on the Yahoo portal. However, this news caused a sensation in the industry that far exceeded the box office miracle of Titanic. Before the release of Titanic, because of the unprecedented $215 million production cost of this super blockbuster focused on CG special effects, the media and the industry reflected on the trend of blockbusters that had emerged in recent years. Many people predicted that the newly emerging CG special effects technology would enter a glacial period that would last for several years after the box office failure of Titanic. However, after the box office explosion of Titanic, the original argument disappeared without a trace. In fact, ever since the box office of Titanic fell in the second week, film companies had already begun to look for project scripts for blockbusters with special effects. There were also many film companies who could not wait to discuss cooperation with the digital domain. Before Titanic, digital domain's attitude towards accepting external orders had always been quite positive. The other film companies also realized that digital domain implemented this open cooperation strategy because of the need to accumulate technology. Therefore, no one expected that after Titanic, Firefly Group's attitude would suddenly change 180 degrees. There was no need to compare the technological advantages of digital domain, because in recent years, all of Hollywood's blockbusters that involved CG special effects basically had close cooperation with digital domain. Moreover, digital domain was often responsible for the most difficult special effects in these films. Therefore, when digital domain suddenly closed the door to cooperation, it was almost conceivable that without the technical support of digital domain, in the next few years, even if the other major Hollywood film companies were willing to spare no effort in investing funds, it would be impossible for them to catch up with digital domain in a short period of time. Without the support of the top special effects technology, the other major Hollywood film companies were destined to usher in a period of a few years of no special effects films. Of course, Hollywood did not lack other special effects companies, such as Industrial Light and Magic. However, if the special effects level of a film produced by Firefly Group was compared to a film produced by Digital Domain, the gap was almost visible to the naked eye. In this case, the audience was not stupid and would not buy it. The day after the news was announced, the phones of almost all the core executives of Firefly Group basically did not stop ringing. The media was also like sharks that smelled blood, frantically digging for the deeper meaning of Firefly Group's decision. Chapter 828. So far, the North American box office of Titanic has successfully exceeded US $300 million, but the box office trend of this phenomenal blockbuster is still very strong. Box office analysts generally predicted that with the North American box office alone, Titanic was likely to recover all of its $265 million investment, and the overseas box office of Titanic was likely to reach a jaw-dropping number. The reflection of the recent big-budget films in the film industry has become vulnerable because of this. Major Hollywood film companies have begun to look for their own blockbuster projects. In this case, Firefly Group suddenly announced that it would stop cooperating with its special effects company in the digital field, which is tantamount to pouring cold water on all Hollywood film companies outside the Firefly system. According to the chairman of the Firefly Group, Jeffrey Katzenberg, the Firefly Group will increase the annual blockbuster films from the current 3 to 6 in the next few years. At least half of them will be blockbusters with special effects. If the digital domain continues to maintain the original open operation model, it will be difficult to meet the needs of the Firefly Group. It is reported that the Digital Field Special Effects Company currently has the top computer CG special effects technology in Hollywood. Since 1991, Digital Field has won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects for 4 consecutive years with the outstanding special effects in films such as Terminator 2, Tornado, and Jurassic Park. At the same time, Digital Field also has the largest rendering farm in the industry, which has been responsible for more than 50% of Hollywood's special effects rendering work in recent years. Relevant analysts predict that because the digital domain has a large amount of unique CG special effects technology in Hollywood, such as the large-scale war scene design in The Mummy 2, the digital domain's sudden move to stop cooperating with foreign companies may even cause a gap in special effects blockbusters for several years. This will undoubtedly have a strong impact on the film business of Time Warner, Paramount, Sony, and other companies. As a result, the market share of Firefly Group, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and 20th Century Fox will greatly increase. Due to the impact of this news, in the past week, the stock prices of Time Warner, Viacom, and other companies have dropped slightly. The stock price of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, which is closest to Firefly Group, has further increased by more than 9% in a week. Michael Eisner threw away the latest issue of Premiere magazine in his hand, stood up and walked to the window in distress, thinking about what to do next. In addition to this analysis article, this issue of Premiere magazine published the latest Hollywood Power Rankings for the year. In addition to Eric Williams occupying the top spot, Jeffrey Katzenberg, the CEO of the Firefly Group, did not follow the usual practice of ranking first with Eric as the controller of the Firefly Group. Instead, he was listed separately and occupied the second position. This change in detail undoubtedly showed Eric's increasingly detached status in Hollywood. The third place still had nothing to do with Worldwide, but with MGM, which had been in the limelight last year. Drew Barrymore and Amy Pascal were tied for third place, and Michael Eisner was fourth. Whether it was intentional or not, in the top 10 of this year's Hollywood Power Rankings, in addition to the executives of major film companies, top directors, and producers, there was also the sudden appearance of the CEO of the digital field, Stan Winston. In other words, the Firefly Group had already occupied 3 places in the top 10 of the Hollywood Power Rankings. If MGM and Fox were included on the list, the Firefly Group basically controlled half of Hollywood, which was almost the same as the influence of the Firefly Group in reality. Even if it was purely based on market share, because of the unexpected explosion of Titanic, which was originally not favored by everyone, Firefly, MGM, and Fox would also have more than 50% of the Hollywood box office market this year. The four major film companies, Warner, Paramount, Universal, and Sony Pictures, could only share the remaining 50% of the box office market with countless second- and third-tier film companies. Plans could never keep up with changes. Michael Eisner sighed in his heart. Thinking of his thoughts before Titanic was released, he could not help but laugh at himself. However, at the moment he still had to solve an urgent problem. In the past week, after Firefly announced that they would stop cooperating with foreign companies in the digital field, Industrial Light and Magic, which was about to reach an agreement with Universal, suddenly changed its mind. Microsoft reacted quickly and announced that it would invest another $100 million into Industrial Light and Magic's CG special effects research and development. Although Industrial Light and Magic was far behind the digital field in recent years, the special effects foundation it had accumulated over the past 20 years was not something that other small special effects companies in Hollywood could compare with. Obviously, because of the box office success of Titanic, Microsoft also saw the huge application of special effects technology in Hollywood. Therefore, they had some other ideas and did not want Universal to interfere. In response to Firefly's announcement, in this week, in addition to Microsoft's large investment in Industrial Light and Magic, Sony, Paramount, and Time Warner also announced to the public that they would establish their own special effects departments. Of course, Universal's board of directors also began to discuss related issues. The chairman of the parent company, Seagram Group, Edgar Bronfman, also called to ask about this matter. However, Michael Eisner knew that establishing an exclusive special effects department would not work at all. He still clearly remembered what Eric said last year when various companies were fighting for the rights to Transformers movie. Digital Domain spent $100 million to build a rendering farm in Florida. This was not something that other second-rate or third-rate special effects companies could easily catch up with. In the past few years, in order to develop all kinds of CG special effects technology, Digital Domain had invested a lot. Although there was no specific data, one could imagine that this number was also very shocking. More importantly, if a special effects company wanted to accumulate enough technology, they needed to obtain it through the production process of a large number of CG shots. According to Firefly's information, in the future, the Firefly Group would focus on CG special effects up to 3 movies a year. Then, even if MGM and 20th Century Fox added up to the same amount as Firefly, the 3 companies could provide orders for 6 special effects movies a year for Digital Domain. Other movies that required a small number of special effects scenes were also countless. This provided Digital Domain with a sufficient platform to accumulate technology. And this was something that Time Warner, Paramount, Sony, and even Universal itself could not do. Michael Eisner's first thought was, of course, to form an alliance. However, from the reaction of Industrial Light and Magic, which was supported by Microsoft, after Firefly announced the news, it could be seen that everyone had their own plans. It was easier said than done to form an alliance. While he was thinking about this, someone knocked on the office door. Michael Eisner responded, and his assistant pushed the door open and said, "Mr. Eisner, I've asked around. Eric Williams went to San Francisco 2 days ago. It seems like it's about a music player that Firefly is secretly developing." Music player? Michael Eisner asked, puzzled. Although the MP3 player was developed at the end of last year, in recent months, Firefly Electronics had been preparing various kinds of preparatory work, so it was basically still in a state of secrecy. Michael Eisner's assistant nodded and said, "It's a brand new digital audio player. Speaking of which, it's a coincidence. Last week, you asked me to participate in the contract negotiations between the company and Miss Nicole Kidman for the sequel of The Mummy. I happened to see Miss Kidman use this player. It's only slightly bigger than an old-fashioned lighter. It uses a micro hard disk as the storage medium, and it can store hundreds of MP3 audio format songs. It doesn't need traditional audio media such as tapes and discs. By the way, I just called the record company." At the end of last year, they also received an invitation from Yahoo to sell songs on the Yahoo Music Store. The two sides are still negotiating. Michael Eisner, who had been listening attentively, immediately had his eyes lit up. He had already vaguely realized a problem just now. If everything was as the assistant said, then the promotion of this music player would definitely require a large number of legitimate music resources as support. The reason why Sony bought Columbia Records back then was because of this consideration. Music copyright resources were precisely Firefly Group's shortcoming. Although Firefly Records had released some good singers in recent years, in terms of heritage, Firefly Records was still thousands of miles away from the established giants such as Universal Records, Warner Records, and Sony Records. "You did a good job." Michael Eisner praised the assistant generously. He then said, "Also prepare a copy of the negotiations between the record company and Yahoo for me, and help me make an appointment with Doug Morris." Doug Morris was the CEO of Universal Records. Seagram took over the MCA group from Panasonic, which mainly included Universal Pictures and Universal Records. However, Michael Eisner was not responsible for Universal Records. Fireflyer, that's the most suitable name we've come up with. Fireflyer is actually a little elf in the fairy tale Peter Pan, who is a little conceited but loyal to his friends. He was born because of the laughter of a baby in Renton. In the story, Fireflyer eventually married Tinkerbell. It can be said that this is a cute character with some small flaws, but the flaws do not obscure the beauty of the character. Our MP3 player product also pursues a user experience similar to that of a close friend, which happens to match Fireflyer's personality. At the same time, Fireflyer can also be seen as an extension of Firefly. In an office building in Oakland, San Francisco, Eric, Chris, and a group of Firefly Electronics executives sat in a conference room and quietly listened to the explanation of Firefly Electronics CEO, Bill Olson. Bill Olson was an executive that Chris had poached from Apple. He used to be a vice president in charge of product marketing at Apple. Originally, even with the backing of Firefly Group, Bill Olson was unlikely to be interested in a small company like Firefly Electronics. However, due to Apple's gradual decline in the past 2 years, the management had all jumped ship to find other jobs. In addition, Eric and Chris had promised him a sufficient salary and options. That was why Bill Olson was willing to become the president of Firefly Electronics. He was mainly responsible for the marketing of the MP3 player. After listening to Bill Olson, Eric said, "Fireflyer is indeed a good name. However, since you mentioned Tinkerbell, Bill, don't you think that we can also apply for this trademark and use it as another brand for the MP3 player? Maybe it's for women?" Bill Olson smiled and said, "Eric, your suggestion was actually brought up by Victor during the naming meeting back then. However, after some discussion, we decided to give up on this idea for the time being." Eric looked at the CEO of Firefly Electronics, Victor McNally. Victor McNally graduated from Stanford University and had a Ph.D. in electronic engineering. Before he was poached by Chris to be in charge of the MP3 and ebook projects, Victor McNally was in charge of product development and production at IBM. Although his position was not very high, his professional ability was outstanding. Chris had asked the headhunting company to look for Victor McNally for 3 months before he was selected. Victor McNally was a slightly plump middle-aged Caucasian man with a beard. He was a little slovenly. When he saw Eric looking at him, he smiled and gestured to Bill Olson. He smiled and said, "Eric, let Bill tell you. He's the expert in this field." Eric looked at Bill Olson again. "It's like this, Eric. Based on the current situation, we only have one product, the Fireflyer. Perhaps we can name the pink version as the Tinkerbell you mentioned, but this will definitely dilute the brand image of the player, which will be detrimental to the product's promotion. On the other hand, this player should be targeted at all consumers, not just women. Even if it's pink, there should be many male consumers who like it. Therefore, if we set a gender distinction for this product, it might cause some consumers trouble. After all, when some people think that a certain product is only for girls, male consumers might not buy it." Eric nodded and said, "Okay, continue." Bill Olson switched to a PowerPoint page, but he still added, "However, Eric, the Tinkerbell trademark is indeed a good one. I'll get the legal department to apply for the Fireflyer trademark and get the Tinkerbell trademark at the same time." Chapter 829. After discussing the naming of the MP3 player, Bill Olson continued. Next is the Yahoo Music Store, or Yahoo Music Box. Currently, we have obtained the authorization to sell about 200,000 songs online. However, there hasn't been much progress in the negotiations with the 5 world-class record companies with the most abundant music copyright resources. Therefore, Fireflyer's main source of music should be CD discs. Thanks to the promotion of the MP3 audio format, more than 50% of the CD discs currently use the MP3 format. Even if it's a non-MP3 format, we can still convert it into MP3 audio through transcoding. The contract between Yahoo and Microsoft would expire in 2 years. Although Microsoft had been under antitrust investigations, it was foreseeable that once the contract expired in July 1999, Yahoo would lose its position as the default browser on the Windows platform if Microsoft gave up on the 30% share acquisition plan. Eric's initial suggestion was to develop a Yahoo Music Store website, but in order to avoid Yahoo's browser being squeezed out by Microsoft in the future, Yahoo has been promoting separate software for various online products in recent years to reduce its dependence on Yahoo's browser. It was the same this time. The teams of Yahoo and Firefly Electronics worked together to perfect Eric's original rough idea in detail, and developed a separate Yahoo Music Box software as a sales platform for online music stores. At the same time, Yahoo Music Box could more conveniently develop specialized software modules to identify pirated CDs and prevent them from being used for audio copying. To be honest, due to the living environment in his previous life, Eric had never considered this at first. He was also glad that the team at Yahoo and Firefly Electronics had thought of this. Otherwise, when Fireflyer was released, Firefly Electronics would definitely be bombarded with lawsuits from major record companies. In front of the projector, Bill Olson looked at Eric again and said, Eric, although Yahoo is trying to gather a large amount of music resources into its own online store, it can activate more paid users under Yahoo Network. But I feel that this is not worth it. Just like Sony, although they have Walkman, they will not expect all the record companies to let them produce music cassettes. This is impossible. In my opinion, Fireflyer has the potential to replace Walkman. If we can be more open and authorize all the music labels to operate their own online music stores, Fireflyer's influence will expand rapidly. Walkman's current annual sales are 15 million units. If Fireflyer can reach this level, based on the selling price of $299, our annual sales will reach $5 billion. Eric said. But Bill, Fireflyer does not have the influence to get all the music labels to set up their own music stores. If we insist, the music labels will definitely ask for more. On the other hand, if Fireflyer has enough influence in the future, we will not need to compromise with the music labels. They will only take the initiative to cooperate with us. But there will always be a suitable time, Eric, Bill Olson said. Although we have installed a piracy detection module on Yahoo Music Box, we still can't stop all piracy. The risk of being sued still exists. If we can completely cut off the channel of CD copying and realize completely digital music sales, we can avoid this situation as much as possible. Eric knew what Bill Olson was thinking. He had hoped that Yahoo Music Box could be separated from Yahoo and be operated by Firefly Electronics alone. However, Eric had rejected him. Since Firefly Electronics could not own this platform, Bill Olson wanted the music sales platform to be more open for the sake of Firefly Electronics' own interests. Eric shrugged and laughed. Bill, we all know that even if we fully implement digital music sales, we will still not be able to stop the piracy problem. But after Sony won the video cassette case, the copyright holders can no longer use lawsuits to stop the advancement of technology. Also, all the Walkman, VCR, CD players, MD Walkman, and DVD players are not able to stop the piracy problem. So, we only need to do what we can. We do not need to worry too much about this problem. From Eric's smile, Bill Olson knew that Eric had seen through his thoughts. He did not feel awkward at all. Instead, he changed the topic and continued to discuss Fireflyer's component purchasing system, sales network, and product marketing. In the past 2 years, Eric had invested about $60 million in the research and development of the MP3 player and ebook reader. This included the cost of commissioning Seagate to develop the microhard disk and the cost of acquiring the Wi-Fi patent rights. Not much was specifically spent on the MP3 player research and development. After all, the research and development team of Firefly Electronics only had 190 people in total. Although the annual salary of Silicon Valley engineers was generally high, the salary expenditure in the past 2 years was only $30 million. However, Bill Olson's budget for Firefly, from component purchasing to product marketing, was $200 million. Eric felt that it was like spending $60 million to produce a movie, but spending $200 million to promote and distribute the movie. Of course, the development of Firefly was definitely worth this budget. Just as Bill Olson had mentioned at the meeting, if Firefly could replace Walkman, it would bring in billions of dollars of revenue for Firefly Electronics every year. Moreover, Eric knew better than anyone that Firefly did indeed have the potential to replace Walkman and all the other portable music players currently available. The meeting lasted until 4 p.m. After confirming the Firefly sales and marketing plan, Eric and Chris visited the company's R&D department with the 2 people in charge of Firefly Electronics. At 6 p.m., everyone had dinner together. Eric flew back to Los Angeles under the cover of the night. Chris would continue to stay and lead the integration of Firefly Electronics and the British ARM chip company. The relevant plan had been confirmed in a conference call with ARM's management yesterday. Before this, Firefly Electronics had already taken out a sample of the ebook reader. However, because the current production cost of this machine was close to $400, if they wanted to ensure enough profit, the sales price should be set at $700. This was a price that ordinary consumers would find difficult to accept. After everyone's discussion, Eric decided to give up on this product for the time being. Instead, he would use the accumulated technology and cooperate with Firefly Electronics, ARM, and Yahoo to develop the Yahoo Pad, a tablet computer with more functions. This was also the second stage of Eric's original plan. He planned to launch a mature product around the year 2000. By then, with the further development of the electronics industry, the manufacturing cost of the Yahoo Pad would definitely drop to a more reasonable price. The Gulfstream business plane landed at Santa Monica Airport in the hazy night. As soon as Eric got off the plane, he received a call from Michael Eisner, who asked if he was free for dinner. Of course, Eric knew Michael Eisner's intentions. If they stopped cooperating with foreign companies in the digital domain for a long time in the future, it would be very difficult for Warner Brothers, Paramount, Universal, and Sony to produce outstanding CG special effects movies. In the past few days, almost all the senior executives of the major film companies had personally called Eric in private to see if there was any possibility of Eric canceling this decision. Michael Eisner's phone call was considered a little late. Considering that he did not have any appointments tonight, Eric agreed and drove to Morton Restaurant in Beverly Hills. This was a famous restaurant that was frequented by Hollywood movie stars. When he arrived at the restaurant, it was almost 9 o'clock. Under the guidance of the waiter, Eric quickly found where Michael Eisner was. Michael Eisner, who was sitting at the table reading a newspaper, saw Eric coming over and stood up. The two shook hands and greeted each other. Eric could not help but tease, "I didn't expect you to choose this restaurant." This sentence was not without reason. It was a past that most people in Hollywood knew. In the mid-1980s, Michael Eisner, who was still the president of Paramount, had a bad relationship with Martin Davis, the chairman of the parent company, and was planning to jump to Disney as the CEO. When he reached an agreement with several people in charge of Disney and resigned from Paramount, the board of directors of Disney had a dispute over the decision to appoint Michael Eisner. This also caused Michael Eisner to suddenly be in a state of unemployment with an uncertain future. Immediately, Michael Eisner, who had just left the power center of Hollywood, immediately encountered a dilemma. One night, he planned to have dinner with his friend Michael Ovitz and called Morton Restaurant to make a reservation. He had never been rejected before, but that time he was suddenly told that the restaurant was full. Michael Ovitz, who was present at the time, called again and easily made a reservation. This kind of thing was simply humiliating for a Hollywood mogul. Michael Eisner heard Eric's teasing, but his expression was very calm. He said lightly, "There are some things that you always have to remind yourself of." "Oh." Eric smiled, and the two sat down. Although they had already had dinner in San Francisco, Eric still ordered food. After the waiter left, Michael Eisner took the initiative to speak. "Eric, I heard that you went to San Francisco these 2 days?" "Well, a company set up there has made a small thing. It will be on the market soon. I went over to take a look." Michael Eisner smiled and said, "Something that you value is definitely not as simple as a small thing, right?" Eric suddenly realized something, but his expression did not change. Instead, he explained in detail, "It's a brand new portable music player. Unfortunately, the sample is in my luggage. Otherwise, I can give you one. It's a very interesting little thing." Since Michael Eisner already knew about this, he no longer hid it. Eric even guessed that Michael Eisner might have already known about Yahoo and Universal Records' online music sales. Obviously, Michael Eisner wanted to use the copyrights of Universal Records as a bargaining chip in exchange for some tangible benefits, such as continuing technical support for Universal Pictures in the digital field. However, he had obviously miscalculated. "Actually, I had lunch with Doug Morris of Universal Records this afternoon, and I happened to hear about this." Michael Eisner did not beat around the bush and said, "I also heard that the cooperation negotiations between Yahoo and Universal Records seem to be in a deadlock." "That's inevitable," Eric said. "Big companies always have the arrogance of big companies. They often can't see the situation clearly. When they have the initiative, they don't want to make progress because of their status. When they lose the initiative one day, they will think of themselves as victims." In the original spacetime, several major record companies originally had far more advantages than Apple to deploy MP3 players, but they either had to maintain their market position of old-fashioned portable players that were about to be eliminated, or the group management system was rigid and slow to respond. In short, in the low-threshold electronic product of MP3 players, although many record companies had tried, they all failed. In the end, Apple occupied more than 70% of the music player market. The major record companies finally had to submit to the rules of Apple's online music sales platform. They were led by the nose by others. From time to time, they complained like resentful women that Apple's players condoned piracy and infringed their rights. What they didn't know was that even without Apple in the internet era, because of the significant reduction in the cost of pirated music, the record industry could no longer maintain its former glory. Of course, Michael Eisner couldn't see the future. Although he felt that Eric's words were somewhat inexplicable, he didn't refute. After chatting for a while, dinner was quickly served. Michael Eisner took a sip of red wine, put down the goblet, and continued. "Eric, I think you must have guessed my thoughts. It's like this. I can help persuade Mr. Bronfman to support the cooperation between Yahoo and Universal Records. But in exchange, I hope that the digital field will continue to cooperate with Universal Pictures. What do you think?" Eric shook his head and said, "Sorry, Michael, I can't agree to your conditions." Michael Eisner was stunned. He didn't expect Eric to refuse so straightforwardly. During the day, he had investigated the situation of Yahoo's online music store in detail. Although it had reached cooperation with some second- and third-tier record companies, the number of song copyrights owned by Yahoo's music store was only 200,000. The more popular songs and albums were limited to the group of teen pop singers cultivated by Firefly Records in recent years. On Universal's side, Universal Records own more than a quarter of the music copyright resources in the United States. If they could reach a cooperation with Universal, the attitude of other record companies would no longer be so firm. Chapter 830. Eric, why do you have to do this kind of self-destructive thing? If the digital field continues to maintain an open cooperation strategy, with the influence brought by Titanic, it won't be a problem to double the annual turnover in the future. And, with the current speed of technological development, it won't take more than a few years for other special effects companies to catch up with the digital field. After deliberating for a moment, Michael Eisner spoke again. Eric raised his head with an inexplicable smile at the corner of his mouth and said, "Michael, what I want is these few years. What's more, if others want to catch up, the digital field will never stop and wait for them." "But I don't think you need to do this at all," Michael Eisner said again. "You see, including the box office of Titanic, Firefly's total box office this year will reach US $2 billion, more than 30% of the market share. This should definitely be the peak of a major Hollywood film company." "No, Michael, you're just used to the coexistence of the 7 major Hollywood companies, so you think this is just the peak state of a major Hollywood film company. But let's break the shackles of this thinking and think about it. Why can't it be 50%, 60%, 70%, or even more? In other industries, this is not rare. In this case, why can't Hollywood?" When Michael Eisner heard Eric's words, he had a slightly shocked expression on his face. He didn't expect Eric to be so ambitious. If someone else said this, Michael Eisner would almost immediately laugh out loud, but the person who said these words was the most popular young man in Hollywood in recent years. And he had done too many things that many people thought were completely impossible. However, after a brief moment of shock, Michael Eisner still shook his head. "Eric, Hollywood is different from other industries. As a creative industry, the human factor is very important in this industry. Although many people say that Hollywood is the world's film factory, you can never gather all the outstanding filmmakers under one company and work in your own factory. Even if Firefly pushes out all the other 6 major Hollywood companies, as long as you can't meet the requirements of all the filmmakers, this is inevitable. Then they're destined to create new film companies to compete with Firefly, just like Chaplin's United Artists a long time ago, Howard Hughes's Thunderbolt Entertainment, and now Spielberg's Bolin." Eric smiled and said, "Michael, I don't know what will happen to Bolin in the future, but the first 2 film companies you mentioned happen to no longer exist. In my opinion, with the prevalence of large capital operations in the film industry, it will become more and more difficult for latecomers to enter this industry. So, I just need to maintain Firefly's sufficient advantage and take over the original film companies one by one." Michael Eisner's eyebrows twitched, and he asked hesitantly, "You mean eat them?" "Yes, eat them." With that said, Eric tasted the crab meat pie in front of him and nodded. "The food here is really good. Maybe I can come here often in the future." "Oh, then you definitely won't encounter a time when there are no seats." Michael Eisner smiled reluctantly. He was still thinking about Eric's words just now. If Firefly wanted to wipe out all the other film companies in Hollywood, it was definitely unrealistic. But if they did as Eric said and merged one by one, then this possibility was not completely impossible. However, Michael Eisner was not so pessimistic. He was now 55 years old. Perhaps Firefly could do all this in 10 or even 20 years, but by then he would definitely have retired. Then everything would have nothing to do with him. Now he just needed to run Universal Pictures well. This slightly dejected thought made Michael Eisner somewhat dispirited. The 2 of them no longer talked about the movie. Instead, they casually commented on the food in the restaurant and other unimportant topics. Eric and Michael Eisner did not have any personal grudges after all. What's more, it was Firefly who used the opportunity of acquiring Disney to drive Michael Eisner out of the Disney Group. In terms of grudges, Michael Eisner's resentment towards Eric was definitely greater. Since the other party did not express this, of course, Eric would not do the same. After skipping the topic of the digital field, the 2 of them had a relatively relaxed and pleasant meal. They chatted until 10 o'clock before the 2 of them separated. Watching Michael Eisner's car leave, Eric also got into his own car. It was already late at night, so Eric did not rush back to the Sharp Corner Manor. Instead, he instructed the driver to drive to the top of Beverly Hills. When he arrived in front of Elizabeth and Julia's mansion, Eric sent the driver away and pressed the doorbell. The intercom rang with an inquiry. Eric answered and the door was quickly opened. Julia's brown hair was loose, and she was only wearing a very long light yellow close-fitting sweater. She stretched out her long legs and appeared in front of Eric lazily. She softly called out, "Eric, you're here." "Yeah." Eric smiled and stretched out his hand. He said, "Aren't you cold dressed like this?" The nights in Los Angeles in February were still a little cold. Julia leaned over and hugged Eric's waist. She intimately kissed his cheek and said, "It's not cold. We're not outside." Eric hugged Julia. Just as he was about to let go, the girl had already placed her chin on his shoulder. Her slender legs were crossed, and she was hanging on him. "Ha, why are you like Drew?" Eric smiled and closed the door. He held Julia's light body and jokingly said, "You seem to have gained a lot of weight." Julia nibbled on Eric's neck like a mouse. She said softly, "It'll feel better if you're a little fatter." "Eric, you can try it now." "I'm afraid of the cold. Let's go inside." Eric almost could not resist. He patted Julia's body. Seeing that the girl had no intention of getting down, he could only carry her into the mansion. Although it was already past 10 o'clock, the lights in the mansion were still on. Eric knew that Elizabeth was actually a night owl. Most powerful people in the workplace were probably like this. The TV was on in the living room, and the sound was very soft. Elizabeth was curled up on the sofa with a thick folder in her hands. She was wearing a close-fitting sweater similar to Julia's. When she saw Eric carrying Julia in, she pursed her lips. "Do you have to be so impatient?" Eric did not explain. He threw Julia on the sofa and sat beside Elizabeth with a smile. He asked, "What are you looking at?" "Some movie project summaries," Elizabeth said. She did not stand on ceremony and handed a stack over. "Here, help me take a look and pick one or two." Eric took it and flipped through it. He smiled and asked, "Can I take them away if I pick one?" Elizabeth said simply, "No." Julia, who was originally thrown on the single-seater sofa by Eric, also came over and sat down next to Eric. Seeing that Elizabeth was reading the document seriously, Eric did not make any more jokes. He just casually picked up Julia's slender legs and placed them on his lap to play with. He also flipped through the documents in his hand. After just glancing at the name of the first document, Eric raised his eyebrows slightly. He patiently read the project summary and the outline of the script, then said, "The English Patient. This project is not bad. It's very suitable for Miramike to use as an award-winning film." Elizabeth turned her head and saw Eric gently rubbing Julia's thigh with one hand. She spat and rolled her eyes. This is the project that Harvey had his eyes on last year. In order to avoid competing with Shakespeare's Love for the Oscars, it was pushed to this year. Of course, it's very suitable for Miramike. Eric nodded and said, "Fortunately, it wasn't released this year. Otherwise, it would be a pity." In Eric's opinion, The English Patient was definitely better than Shakespeare's Love. It had a deeper artistic connotation. It would be a pity if it was released this year and was defeated by Titanic. Elizabeth, of course, knew what Eric meant. She thought of the recent Titanic that was in the limelight around the world. She suddenly recalled some details from last year. She turned around and stared at Eric. "You must have done it on purpose that time." Eric had a puzzled expression on his face as his words came out of nowhere. "That time, you said that you wanted Fox to invest $50 million in Titanic." Eric suddenly remembered. Of course, he did it on purpose. He just wanted to find out more about the old man in the Elizabeth family. Rupert Murdoch had personally rejected the cooperation and investment invitation. Now, although the strong box office trend of Titanic showed no signs of stopping, after this week, Firefly would probably be able to recoup the original production cost of $215 million. It was estimated that by the end of February, all the production and distribution costs would be recouped. Then Titanic would bring net profits to Firefly. Now, no box office forecasting agency could predict the global box office of Titanic, but they knew that the profits brought to Firefly by Titanic would definitely far exceed the original total investment of $265 million. Some media even predicted that if Titanic could become the highest-grossing film in North America and even the world, with the strong influence of the Champion effect, Titanic could bring Firefly no less than $1 billion in box office, videotapes, DVDs, and other peripheral products. This was almost more than the total annual profits of most studios. However, looking at Elizabeth staring at him like a cat, Eric would never admit it. But Elizabeth realized this from Eric's brief hesitation. She suddenly rushed over like an angry kitten, kicked Julia away, straddled Eric, grabbed his collar and said, "You bastard, you really did it on purpose." Eric had an unconcealable smile on his face. He raised his hands in surrender and said, "Liz, calm down, I'm not a god. How would I know what the box office of Titanic would be like? Didn't you see that I almost had anxiety because of this some time ago?" Hearing Eric's words, Julia, who was pushed aside, looked at Elizabeth's angry face as if she wanted to tear Eric in half. She was inexplicably a little excited, but she couldn't help but say, "Yes, yes." "Shut up." Elizabeth glared at Julia and then stared at Eric. "You did it on purpose. Now that it's over, aren't you very proud? I swear to God." "Bah, you're not religious at all," Elizabeth said as she unbuttoned a few buttons on Eric's shirt. Eric was about to continue quibbling, but when he saw Elizabeth leaning over, he immediately became alert and quickly said, "Don't bite." "Ah." Before he could reach out to stop her, he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. Julia curled up next to him and looked at Elizabeth biting Eric's shoulder with her little white teeth. She was very envious, and her whole little heart trembled. She couldn't help but reach out to touch it. When she retracted her hand, she saw a trace of blood on her fingertips. She immediately felt sorry and pushed Elizabeth. "Liz, stop, it's bleeding." Elizabeth, who was originally angry, let go of Eric when she heard Julia's words. Seeing that the teeth marks on his shoulder were indeed bleeding, she hurriedly reached out to press it and said, "Eric, I'm sorry, I didn't do it on purpose." Eric gasped and turned his head to look. There were 2 rows of obvious teeth marks on his shoulder. There were only a few scratches and it wasn't serious. Seeing Elizabeth's apologetic and even crying expression, he couldn't feel any anger in his heart. He nodded solemnly and said, "Yes, I know you didn't do it on purpose." Thinking of the topic they were arguing about just now, Elizabeth's mouth twitched when she heard Eric's words, but she didn't say anything. She took the tissue from Julia and helped Eric wipe the blood off. She said, "Do you need to apply some medicine?" Eric smiled and said, "It's said that saliva has a disinfectant effect." Elizabeth rolled her eyes and moved to the side. She said to Julia, "You do it." Julia immediately leaned over, but Eric hurriedly stopped her. Okay, I was just kidding. Sit properly and don't mess around. Put your tongue away too. It's so ugly." Julia chuckled. Seeing that she had occupied Elizabeth's seat and was straddling Eric, she was unwilling to leave. She intimately leaned over and kissed Eric a few times on the face. She propped herself up and reached out to take off the long, close-fitting sweater on her body. There was nothing covering her body except for a pair of pure white underwear. Seeing Julia's actions, Elizabeth was very displeased. "Hey, I just changed the sofa cover yesterday. Can you guys go to the bedroom?" The response to Elizabeth was a strong hand that pulled her over. Eric's voice rang out. "Take off your sweater too. Let me see." The lights in the living room seemed to be blurred. Amidst the light rustling, a woman's half-true and half-false murmur could be heard. "You reckless bastard." "Ah." Chapter 831. Speaking of which, George has already confirmed the casting of Queen Amidala. You happen to know her? The next morning, Eric drove to Firefly Studios. From Beverly Hills to Praia Vista, he happened to pass by Century City, so Elizabeth took Eric's car to go to work. Star Wars prequel had been delayed until now due to the establishment of Amblin Pictures, but it was finally confirmed that it would start shooting in April. As the distributor, Elizabeth was now fully in charge of the project. She had been busy with this matter recently. Although Fox couldn't intervene in the production of the movie, most of the filming in the studio was confirmed to be done on Fox's set. On the way to Century City, the two couldn't help but talk about this topic. Eric was really uninterested in the Star Wars series, and he wasn't very interested in whether the female lead was still Natalie Portman. However, hearing Elizabeth's excited tone, he asked curiously, "Who is it?" Elizabeth leaned towards Eric and said with a smile, "Take a guess. I'll give you a hint. It's a girl of 16 or 17 years old. You personally discovered her to enter Hollywood." When Eric heard what she said, He was more or less certain that the trajectory of history coincided with the past. However, this wasn't too surprising. Ever since Lyon, the Killer, Natalie Portman had been the most outstanding child star in recent years. In addition to her wonderful performance in Lyon, the Killer, Natalie had also acted in films such as Thief of Fire, Everyone Says I Love You, and so on. Not to mention, she was Jewish, which made her even stronger. Queen Amidala in the Star Wars series was one of the most important symbols of American film culture. Whether it was intentional or not in Hollywood, where Jews gathered, this group of people would definitely be more inclined to push for a Jewish girl to play this role. Although this was what he thought, Eric deliberately made a wild guess. Let me think. Kirsten Dunst? Elizabeth blinked and suddenly raised her eyebrows and said sourly, "Who is Kirsten Dunst? Why don't I know her?" Eric subconsciously touched his nose and said, "The little girl in Night Interview with the Vampire." "Don't look at me like that, okay? I've only seen her a few times. I don't even know what she looks like now." It was only then that Elizabeth remembered Night Interview with the Vampire. She snorted softly and said, "All right, I won't keep you guessing. Who knows what kind of woman will pop out to piss me off? It's Natalie Portman, the girl you met in Long Island a few years ago. Everyone is quite satisfied with her." "Yes, he's a very clever little guy." Eric nodded in agreement. As they chatted casually, the car entered Century City and soon drove into the Fox set. Elizabeth subconsciously adjusted the Hermes scarf around her neck, turned to Eric, and raised her chin slightly. "Hey, can you see the traces?" Eric stretched out his hand to help her tidy up, covering the red mark that was exposed. He smiled and said, "Even if you don't cover it, who would dare to say anything?" Elizabeth rolled her eyes at him. "Okay, I'll take off the scarf. You can go to the meeting with me." Eric didn't think he was that thick-skinned, so he immediately changed his words. "Forget it, I think it's better to cover it." "You bastard!" Elizabeth scolded angrily. The car stopped, and the driver got out to open the door. Elizabeth leaned over and kissed Eric. She picked up her bag and said, "You don't have to get out of the car. I'll go there myself." Eric nodded and watched Elizabeth walk into the office building before instructing the driver to start the car. In Casino Royale, except for the scene where the plane swooped down at the airport, which required full CG, there weren't many scenes that required special effects processing. Therefore, the post-production progress was relatively fast. After returning from San Francisco, the special effects scenes of Casino Royale were completed in February. The film entered the final editing stage, which could be said to be the most important step in determining the quality of a film. In late February, Eric didn't pay attention to anything else, but devoted himself to the editing of Casino Royale. At the same time, after Firefly Electronics finalized the final plan, they officially launched the advertising campaign for the MP3 player, Fireflyer. Although it could be predicted that Fireflyer would have a very broad market prospect around the world, Bill Olson and the other executives still decided to explore the North American market step by step. With the support of a large number of media resources from Firefly's system, the delicate and small figure of Fireflyer quickly appeared on the major television, online, and print advertising platforms in North America. Firefly Electronics also worked with the regional Yahoo portal, with great fanfare. They very generously took out 10,000 prototypes and held a promotional campaign on the Yahoo portal. As long as users activated their Yahoo Music Box account, they could get a lucky draw chance every day to win a free trial of Fireflyer. At the same time, users also had the opportunity to get Yahoo Music Store gift vouchers of different denominations to buy songs in the Yahoo Music Store. Although the campaign of giving away 10,000 units of Fireflyer and a large number of gift vouchers directly brought a huge marketing cost of US $3 million to Firefly Electronics and Yahoo Portal, the effect was very obvious. This was because users only needed to bind their personal credit card information to the Yahoo Pay tool and activate it. They did not need to make any substantial purchases. In just 1 week, the number of new users of Yahoo Pay exceeded 700,000, and the total number of users was close to the 5 million mark. Before this, Yahoo Pay's promotional channel was mainly to cooperate with online payment websites such as Amazon, which was heavily supported by Firefly Investments. As e-commerce had just sprouted, users were also concerned about the security of online payment tools. After more than a year of launch, Yahoo Pay's user base was only slightly more than 4 million. Compared to the 50 million internet users in North America, this ratio was far from satisfactory. With the further promotion, Firefly quickly attracted the attention of a large number of users. At the end of February, according to the results of a survey by Yahoo Portal, Firefly Electronics showed that the monthly shipment of Firefly in North America in April was likely to reach 100,000 units. Moreover, this was a relatively conservative estimate. On the other hand, at the end of February, Yahoo also came out with its first decent annual financial report since its establishment 5 years ago. In 1996, the number of internet users in the world exceeded the 80 million mark. As the world's largest internet market, the number of internet users in North America had doubled compared to 1995, reaching 50 million. With the explosive development of the internet industry in North America, Yahoo Network Company, which occupied more than 70% of the internet online service market, realized operating revenue of US $194 million for the year by relying on its large number of users, such as portals, online mailboxes, search engines, and personal homepages. Thanks to the great success of Yahoo Advertising Alliance, 90% of this revenue came from the internet advertising business. In order to achieve rapid expansion in North America and overseas countries such as the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Australia, Japan, and even Latin America's Brazil, Yahoo invested up to US $335 million in operating expenses in 1996. The annual financial report still showed a loss of US $140 million. However, compared to 1995's revenue of less than US $25 million, the 776% growth in 1 year still surprised many people. At the same time, although Yahoo's growth in the coming year was predicted to slow down compared to last year, the company still gave a conservative estimate of 200% growth. As long as Yahoo could reach this figure, it was likely to break even or even make a small profit from next year. This was undoubtedly very beneficial for Yahoo's IPO. To pave the way for Yahoo's IPO in the next 2 years, after the annual financial report was released, Yahoo did not hesitate to publish the relevant data on its portal homepage. This also caused a huge sensation in the industry. Everyone knew what an annual growth rate of more than 700% meant. The Nasdaq market was particularly sensitive to this data. The shares of the internet technology stocks that were already listed were stimulated by Yahoo's annual financial report, and their share prices rose. Wall Street was also very excited. After Yahoo's annual financial report, Yahoo's valuation was raised to US $9 billion. Eric, who was in Los Angeles, was also very surprised when he saw the financial report. He thought Yahoo's revenue growth would be delayed by at least a year, or even longer. It seems that Yahoo's early appearance had changed a lot of things. When Eric was reading about Yahoo's overseas expansion, he could not help but think about his hometown. Seeing that Yahoo did not have any plans to expand there, he was puzzled and asked someone to investigate. According to some scattered information, the number of internet users in China was only 200,000 at the end of 1996, and the number of PCs sold in China was only 700,000. Correspondingly, the number of internet users in 1996 exceeded 80 million worldwide, and 79 million PCs were shipped in 1996. The US PC sales alone exceeded 26 million. Well, Eric looked at a simple page of information and put it aside for the time being. It was hard for him to think of anything. After Yahoo's annual financial report, Cisco and AOL, the two IT companies that Firefly had a large stake in, also released their annual financial report. Compared to Yahoo, these two companies' results were much more solid and bright. Even AOL, which was slightly weaker, had a turnover of US $1.8 billion for the year. Moving back to Hollywood, February 27th, the 10th week after the release of Titanic, the box office still reached US $25.3 million. At the same time, the cumulative box office officially exceeded US $400 million, reaching US $417 million. Because the box office of Titanic was still stable at US $20 million, the agency predicted that Titanic would break the US $460 million box office record set by Star Wars in the 12th week of its release. It could even go one step further. During the Oscars at the end of March, the total box office of Titanic would exceed US $500 million and become the first movie in North America to do so. In the overseas market, as Titanic was released one after another in some unimportant overseas countries and regions, the film's overseas box office had expanded to 27 countries. Although the more important overseas box office countries such as France, Germany, and Japan had to wait until Titanic was released before and after the most influential Oscar awards ceremony, due to the increase in the number of overseas box office, the growth of Titanic's overseas box office also began to increase. Among them, the most surprising was the Brazilian market, which had a very ordinary box office performance in the past. Although it was the country with the largest box office in Latin America, under normal circumstances, a Hollywood film that could achieve US $10 million in box office in Brazil was already a very good result. Even Jurassic Park, which set a global box office record a few years ago, only had a total box office of US $14.9 million in Brazil. Therefore, Firefly did not categorize Brazil as a box office country that needed special attention. Therefore, on February 7, Titanic was released in Brazilian cinemas. Immediately, the box office performance of Titanic in Brazil also exceeded everyone's expectations. In just 2 weeks, the box office of Titanic in Brazil exceeded US $10 million. This figure was far beyond the expectations of Firefly's Brazilian branch. Originally, although Titanic had shown signs of a box office miracle in North America, the Brazilian branch still only predicted that the box office of Titanic in Brazil was likely to be the same as Jurassic Park, with a total box office of about US $15 million. After exceeding US $10 million in 2 weeks, even the head office no longer ignored the box office prospects of Titanic in Brazil. With Katzenberg's personal intervention, the film's screening schedule in Brazil quickly increased by about 50% and increased the publicity. Immediately, in the 3rd week of release, the box office of Titanic in Brazil did not decrease but increased instead. The box office in a single week reached US $6.9 million and the cumulative box office reached US $17 million. It easily broke the box office of Titanic that year, which was less than US $15 million. Because Titanic completely exceeded the box office curve of common sense, no one knew how big the box office potential of the film in Brazil was. Firefly Studios, Praia Vista, Los Angeles. After more than half a month of intense work, the preliminary editing of Casino Royale had been completed. A group of senior executives and the film's main creators gathered in the viewing room of Firefly Studios' post-production center to watch the movie sample. The sample had not yet produced the opening and closing credits, and the total length was 150 minutes. Eric planned to further compress the scene to reach a length of about 140 minutes. For a popcorn movie, this length was the most suitable. After all, there was only one film in the history of Hollywood that lasted more than 3 hours and achieved a box office miracle like Titanic. Chapter 832. The story of Casino Royale itself was very simple. It was a confrontation between James Bond and the Ghost Gang over a huge bet of $150 million. The whole movie was a complete and smooth story consisting of the airport crisis, the confrontation in the casino, and the final battle. Even the appearance of the Angel Trio, because of the foreshadowing of the first 2 movies of Breakin' Beauties, the movie didn't need to add much to the background of the trio at all. It was just a hot action scene. After years of personally directing many big-budget movies, Eric was more and more able to grasp the key factors for the success of a big-budget commercial movie. The most important one was that the movie story should be simple and clear. This actually coincided with the high-concept movie theory that appeared in the 1980s. The simpler the core storyline, the more room for the movie director to express himself during the shooting process. The most classic example of this was Cameron's Terminator. The whole story revolved around the T-800 being sent by Skynet to assassinate Sarah Connor in the past. There were no complicated side plots. Because of this, Cameron proudly expressed his personal movie talent to his heart's content. In the end, the movie earned $80 million at the global box office with a cost of $6 million, and it made Cameron into the ranks of the top directors in Hollywood. On the contrary, if a movie wanted to show too much to the audience, the result would often be that the director couldn't tell a complete story in 2 hours. There were many examples of failure due to this reason in Hollywood. In the screening hall, the executives of MGM and the main creators of the movie were obviously very satisfied with the effect of the movie. Traditional 007 movies often had the shortcoming of fragmented stories. The producers often inserted some plot that had nothing to do with the main storyline of the movie, just to highlight Bond's romantic and heroic image. Therefore, most of the episodes were full of loopholes. Casino Royale completely reversed this shortcoming while retaining the traditional 007 style. Bond no longer inexplicably appeared in the military base of a nameless villain to kill everyone. Nor was he suddenly called out from the bed of a hot girl to carry out a mission by the MI6. At the end of the screening, the lights were turned on, and there was a burst of applause in the screening room. Knowing that Eric was not an opinionated director, everyone began to speak freely in the screening room, expressing their various opinions about the film. Although Eric was also very satisfied with the final result of Casino Royale, he also knew that the players involved would not be able to see the situation clearly. Because of their different ideas, perhaps the plot that he thought was good would be very inappropriate in the eyes of others. Everyone discussed for more than an hour, and Eric had roughly decided on a few changes. He planned to make a second change to the film in the next week. According to the production and release schedule of Casino Royale, the film would be completed in March. During this period, the movie would also undergo a further internal test screening. It was similar to the closed beta test of online games. Some ordinary audience members would be selected to watch the movie in a theater with a real-time monitoring system installed. There was a special button on the armrest of the audience seats. During the movie, if the audience felt bored or disgusted by certain scenes, they could press the button at any time. The production company would then make further adjustments to the movie based on the real-time feedback of the audience. After that, they would enter the grading, promotion, and other stages. Of course, these processes were not fixed. Everything depended on the distribution of power among the film investors, producers, directors, and other parties. If a director had absolute control over the production of the film, the investors and producers could not interfere. Of course, the director could edit the film completely according to his own ideas. On the contrary, if the final editing power was firmly in the hands of the producers, the director might not be able to interfere at all during the final editing stage. Of course, Eric had absolute control over Casino Royale. As long as he wanted, he could edit the film completely according to his own ideas. However, this was obviously unwise. Even Titanic had gone through the closed beta test stage. Cameron had also modified part of the plot according to the feedback of the audience. After discussing the changes and having lunch at Firefly Studios, everyone left. The headquarters of MGM had moved to Venice Beach, which was not far from Firefly Studios. It was also near the original headquarters of Flowers Pictures. Because Corkery sold all of MGM Studios as land, now most of MGM's films that needed to be shot in the studio were basically rented at Firefly Studios. With the revival of MGM, the management of MGM also discussed the plan to rebuild the studio. Drew also asked Eric for his opinion, but was rejected by Eric. In recent years, more and more films began to pursue the effect of filming, especially big productions. Unless it was a special effects scene, it was rarely shot in the studio. Coupled with the gradual rise of the tax rebate system in the US states and even overseas, Hollywood films would choose to shoot in Los Angeles in the future. If MGM built a studio at this time, it would only cause unnecessary waste of resources. Eric and Drew sent off the Broccoli siblings together. Seeing the girl leave the parking lot with him, Eric asked with a smile, Don't you have work in the afternoon? Drew took 2 steps forward and intimately held Eric's arm. She smiled and said, "Yes, it's an audition for a movie, but I don't want to go at the moment. Anyway, Amy and the others will look after me." "Oh," Eric smiled and said, "What movie?" "Alien, a sci-fi horror film." Eric nodded and did not express anything strange. In his memory, this film should be a work of 1995. However, since many films were produced in advance, it was not strange that some films were delayed for a year or two. It was very common for Hollywood films to prepare for 8 to 10 years. Speaking of this, the girl became interested again. She said, "Today's audition is for the female lead. I also let Natasha try. Unfortunately, the 2 of them are too stupid. In front of the camera, they are like 2 pieces of wood. They can't even speak." Eric turned his head and looked at the twins quietly behind them. Hearing Drew's words, the sisters were a little embarrassed. When they saw Eric looking at them, they lowered their heads in unison. Because Eric liked to use Ivanka as a mascot in his movies, the girl once said that she wanted the Natasha sisters to be mascots in Flower Pictures movies. Unfortunately, Eric had never seen the twins appear in front of the camera even once. It seemed that they really didn't have the talent. Ever since Ivanka made a cameo appearance in Scream, she often appeared and disappeared mysteriously in all kinds of movies. Remembering that the female lead of Alien in the original Space-Time, Natasha Henschutz, happened to be in the Victoria's Secret Army, Eric asked, "Since the audition is at the MGM headquarters, it should be the last round. Do you have anyone in mind?" Amy originally wanted to cast Paulina Pliskova, but the director didn't agree, so we had to choose again. Eric thought of Pliskova's face that resembled Audrey Hepburn's. If it were him, he wouldn't agree either. The female lead of Alien should be the type of actress with a cold temperament and a hot body like Natasha Henschutz. Paulina Pliskova's temperament was too elegant. She was only suitable for the role of the Princess of Monaco. Other than directing the Victoria's Secret Army show, Eric and Natasha Henschutz did not have much contact. At this time, he did not say anything superfluous. He just said casually, "If the budget is enough, we can let Claudia try." Claudia Schiffer was more than enough to replace Natasha Henschutz. The 2 of them had very similar temperaments. The girl shook her head. "We invited her, but Claudia didn't want to act. Because there are a lot of bad scenes in the film and the production budget is not that high, we plan to use a cheaper newcomer." The 2 walked all the way. They did not go back to Eric's office in the administrative center. Instead, they went to the office loft of the Digital Domain. Cameron had already arrived in the morning, but Eric was busy with Casino Royale, and the 2 of them only met twice. During lunch, Eric did not see Cameron's figure, and did not know if he had left. Walking into the number 1 loft of the Digital Domain, and asking the staff, Eric quickly found Cameron in the lounge area, who was sitting at a table with Stan Winston, and talking about something. The great success of Titanic, on a global scale, had completely relieved Cameron of the initial pressure. Recently, he had been quite high-spirited. Seeing Eric approaching, Cameron and Stan Winston stood up and greeted him. After greeting him, the 4 of them sat down at a long table. Eric asked the twins to make coffee, but Cameron could not wait to say, "Eric, I didn't expect you to hide something good here. You didn't even tell me before." Eric smiled and said, "You are more familiar with this place than your own home. What can be hidden from you?" As a film technology fanatic, whenever Cameron appeared at Firefly Studios, most of the time he was there for the Digital Domain. Even if he was not working, Cameron often came to see some of the new special effects technology that had just been developed by the Digital Domain. In the past few years, the 2 sides had worked together very happily. In terms of technology, the Digital Domain had spared no effort in supporting Cameron's films. This also led to Cameron not creating his own Lightstorm studio. Most of the time, he only used the Digital Domain's resources to realize his various ideas. This, in turn, allowed the Digital Domain to benefit a lot. Stan Winston saw Eric looking at him in confusion and explained, "Eric, it's the IMAX and 3D screen that we just installed." Eric immediately understood. Last year in New York, After accidentally noticing IMAX, Eric asked the digital domain to set up a related technical team to cooperate with the Canadian IMAX company to develop IMAX and polarized 3D technology. These two technologies had actually been around for decades, but for various reasons they had not been popularized on a large scale in the film industry. Now, with the funding and technical support of the digital domain, the related applications were quickly developed. The IMAX company was also doing the final public relations for the conversion of ordinary film to IMAX film technology. It was expected that the normal 2-hour IMAX film would be realized next year. Before that, IMAX films were only 40 minutes long, and the conversion technology was not mature enough. Polarized 3D technology was even simpler. In order to carry out various tests, the digital domain had recently installed a 3D IMAX, combined big screen in the studio. This should be the good stuff that Cameron was talking about. In the past 6 months, Cameron had been busy with the production of Titanic. Coupled with the pressure of the film's cost and box office, Cameron naturally did not pay attention to the new technology of the digital domain. These are some ideas that I came up with last year. Look, from silent movies to sound movies, from black and white movies to color movies, it took less than 30 years. Now 30 years have passed, and there should be some new changes in the movie broadcasting situation. That's why I'm optimistic about these two technologies. Cameron was quite excited. Eric, you're saying that you plan to popularize 3D and IMAX on a large scale? Eric shook his head slightly and smiled. That's what I'm thinking, but it has to be done step by step. You must have experienced it by now, so you'll definitely realize the difficulty of popularizing these two technologies. 3D might be easier, as long as you change the 3D projector and the related supporting facilities, but for IMAX, it's obviously not realistic for most theaters in North America to change IMAX screens. The number of movie screens in North America had exploded over the past few years, from 22,000 screens in the early 90s to 28,000 screens now. However, the more developed the film industry was, the more difficult it was to reform it. There were 28,000 screens in the United States, and most of them were theaters built according to the specifications of ordinary 2D screens. These theaters could not accommodate IMAX screens that were dozens of meters long and wide. If they wanted to promote it, they would have to build new theaters. Therefore, Eric's first step was to start with the easier 3D. As a movie fanatic, Cameron was more idealistic than Eric. When he heard what he said, he was not discouraged. Instead, he said, "Eric, I believe that as long as you want to do it, you will definitely succeed. So don't you think that maybe we can try this technology on Spider-Man? Think about the scene of Peter Parker flying over tall buildings on a huge IMAX screen. Oh, and with the addition of 3D, that scene must be very shocking." That you're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.